Hello everybody, this is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I am going to read to you the first 10 chapters of my ghost story called Hallows House. This is part 1, The Stranger. The names and places have been changed to protect the identities of those still alive and those who have passed on. Let's begin. A curious encounter on All Hallows Eve last year prompted us to do some research into our house and its history. This sparked a series of events that we still don't fully understand and sent us on a journey into the past, rediscovering people long dead and events long since forgotten about. The us that I refer to are myself and my daughter Rachel, and the story begins, as I have said, 1 year ago, on the late afternoon of the 31st of October, 3 days after we had moved into our new home in the English northwestern coastal town of Monk's Ferry. The old house at the bottom of Orchard Road was about 146 years old. We only discovered this when we found a curious handwritten mark scratched into the side of the slate front doorstep, which read H.H. 1873 E and J, with another additional word we couldn't decipher. The writing was quite small, and you couldn't see it unless you were crouched down at the side of the step. My eagle-eyed daughter Rachel had spotted it on the morning we moved in, while we were sitting on the step waiting for the removals van to deliver our belongings. We thought it was intriguing, but once the removals van arrived and everybody got busy, the little inscription was forgotten about. The nights were drawing in at this time of the year, and even though it was only 5 p.m, it was already quite dark. Rachel was upstairs in her new bedroom unpacking boxes. She had finished university a few months before and was working part-time in the local library and living at home until she could find her own place. She'd picked the largest of the 3 rooms at the back of the house, which overlooked the old kitchen and overgrown walled garden and yard. From her bedroom window you could also see the ancient spire and grounds of All Hallows Church, and to the right of that, an old and crumbling manor house, which was mostly obscured from view by dense foliage and trees. I sat watching the TV downstairs in the once grand living room with a cup of tea. There was a rerun of the Great British Bake Off on, and somebody was dripping icing over a delicious-looking Victoria sponge. My tummy began to rumble, and I was just beginning to wonder whether we had any cake in the kitchen cupboard, when a loud chiming sound came resonating out of the hallway and gave me a start. On investigation, it seemed that the sound had come from the old grandfather clock that sat in the large hallway. It had been left behind by previous occupants of the house, and I'd assumed it didn't work. At least it hadn't made any sound since we'd moved in. Rachel shouted down from upstairs, "If that was that old clock making that racket, it's got to go, Mom." It was pretty loud, I muttered to myself, and made my way up the wide, creaking staircase to Rachel's room to see if she needed any help unpacking. She was sitting in the window seat, looking out over the high stone wall that divided our small garden from the church grounds. "You know it's the 31st today, All Hallows Eve," she said, without taking her eyes away from the view beyond. "I wonder if the kids around here go in for trick or treat." "I've no idea," I answered. "You know, we've been so busy, it never even occurred to me. But we haven't got anything to give them, even if they do come round. No sweets, not even any cake." "You've been watching Bake Off," she laughed, turning to me. "I thought I heard the theme tune just now." Yes, and now I'm starving, I smiled. So what do you want to do about the trick-or-treaters? Maybe we should turn off all the lights and pretend we're not in, she said, grinning. Well, the house has been empty for about 18 months, so perhaps the locals won't bother us, I said hopefully. Perhaps, she agreed, turning back to her window and the view beyond our garden wall. It was around 7:30 later that evening, and we were both sat together on the sofa in the front room with the curtains tightly drawn and the lights off. The TV was on with the sound down low. There was an old rerun of Antiques Roadshow on, and it flickered quietly in the background. A woman in a brightly coloured blouse was getting very excited about an ugly green teapot. Rachel was curled up with her phone, engrossed in a WhatsApp conversation with university friends, and I was attempting, without much success, to finish the knitted cardigan I'd found at the bottom of a packing box. Thankfully, we hadn't had any Halloween callers up to that point, but we'd heard plenty of passing footsteps and chattering children's voices outside. Another hour went by, and it had started to rain quite heavily. I can't see any trick-or-treaters calling now, can you? I said to Rachel. Nah, not now. I'll put the lights back on, she said, reaching over and turning on the lamp. You know, I can't quite believe we did this, she laughed. It feels a bit mean, sitting in the dark, trying to avoid an awkward confrontation with little ghouls and ghosts because we haven't got any sweeties or... She was interrupted by a sudden sharp rapping on the front door. We both jumped. Oh, hell, spoke too soon, she said, reaching over again to turn off the lamp. Rachel, that's not going to do any good, I said, scolding her playfully. I think we've already been found out. I got up to go to the front door, with Rachel protesting behind me. We haven't got anything to give them, Mum, remember? No sweeties, no cake. I opened the large wooden front door with the decorative brass handle and peered out into the rainy night. I'm so sorry, but we don't have anything for you, I began. But I was instantly taken aback, for instead of the expected children in their damp Halloween costumes, a tall stranger stood before me. He cleared his throat and held out a gloved hand. Surprised, I held out my own hand and shook his. It felt thin underneath the damp kid glove. He wore a dark overcoat, which was also wet with the rain, and a black felt top hat, speckled with raindrops. The brim of his hat cast a dark shadow across his face, although I could just make out a thin moustache and small round metal glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. Oddly, his old-fashioned dress didn't seem out of place on this cold, dark, rainy Halloween evening. I could sense Rachel's presence behind me as she put her hand on my shoulder and peered over me at the curious gentleman on our doorstep. He withdrew his hand from mine and cleared his throat again, bowing slightly. "Good evening," he said in a low voice. There was a hint of an accent, but I couldn't quite make out what it was. "The Messrs. Pike send their regards. They believe you are the new occupants of the house and would like me to pass on to you this package." There he stopped, and noticing Rachel behind me, exclaimed, "Miss Pike, I had no idea. Please forgive me." He took a step back and lowered his gaze with a small bow. Rachel shifted at my side uncomfortably. "No, you're mistaken," I said, confused. "This is my daughter Rachel. We don't know anybody by the name of Pike. I think maybe you have the wrong house." He looked up again and shook his head. "I could have sworn," he said in confusion. "You are the image of my mistress. A trick of the light, perhaps. Miss..." "My name is Rachel," she said bluntly. "My mum just told you that. Who are you? And what do you want? It's cold with the door open, and we're getting wet. He ignored her protests, cleared his throat again, and continued. My name? My name is of no concern. I only wish to pass on my employer's regards and this small package. The Messrs. Pike beg your assistance. All you need is inside. He held out a large rectangular brown paper envelope tied with old string. Rachel took it from him hesitantly. He bowed again, slightly, doffed his hat and said quietly, I shall wish you both a good night. He turned slowly and began to walk away down the garden path. I shouted after him, I'm sorry, what do you mean? You need our assistance. But my question was lost to the rain and darkness, and he was gone. What the hell, Mum? These parcel delivery drivers are getting weirder, joked Rachel, as I closed the door quietly. We both looked at each other, and then at the package. Who was he? She said, turning the envelope over in her hands. What is this? And what did he call me? Miss Pike? Yes, that's what he said, I answered. He's definitely got the wrong address, though. Probably best not to open that package. He may come back for it once he realises he's got the wrong house. Rachel agreed with a shrug and tossed the envelope on the hallway table. The evening passed without further event, and the following morning I had almost forgotten our strange Halloween encounter until Rachel came down in her dressing gown, looking a little tired and dishevelled. Morning, she said. Any tea in the pot? Yes, it's a fresh brew, I answered. She sat down at the breakfast table and combed a hand through her tangled hair. I had the oddest dream last night, Mum. Must have something to do with that weird Victorian man coming to the door. Victorian man? I laughed. You know what I mean, she smiled. I poured her some tea, and she cupped her hands around the mug and took a sip. Yeah, I think the dream also had something to do with the strange light I kept seeing out of my bedroom window last night. Strange light? I said. You didn't tell me about that. Well, I didn't think anything of it at first. It was coming from the old manor house at the back, from one of the top floor windows, and there seemed to be someone there, in the house, looking out. I'm not sure that's even possible, Rach. It's empty. I'm pretty sure it's a ruin. Yeah, I know. I think I was just a bit spooked. I dreamt that I was in the house, that house, but it wasn't me. It was somebody else. It's stupid. It doesn't make sense. Suddenly, she stood up and started making her way to the hallway. I'm going to open that package, she said. Rach, I thought we agreed last night that it probably wasn't for us, I shouted after her. Too late, she called back mischievously, returning in a moment with the envelope under her arm and pulling at the string that was wrapped tightly around it. He never came back, so it must be for us. The string came loose, and Rachel tore a strip off the top of the envelope and reached inside to remove the contents. So, I said expectantly, what's in it? Well, there's some old papers and a key, she exclaimed, pulling out a large brass key from the packet and holding it aloft. She discarded the envelope and the rest of its contents on the breakfast table and examined the key, scrutinising it closely and testing the weight of it in her hand. It was about 4 inches long and heavy. There's something written on it, she mused. The number 3 and some kind of inscription. She knelt down near the fireplace and examined the key against the light of the fire that I had recently set. Well, this is strange. The inscription is the same one on our front doorstep. It says HH 1873 E and J. But there's more. It also says Pike. E and J Pike. Pike, I said. The name used by the weird man, Rachel cut in. Rachel, don't call him the weird man, I scolded. She rolled her eyes at me and continued to scrutinise the key. Is there any other writing on it? I asked. She turned the key over in her hands again and then placed it on top of the envelope. No, that's it. Just the number and that bit of writing. I wonder if it fits something in the house. A secret door, perhaps, she exclaimed, and gave me a wink. But what did he say? The Messrs. Pike wanted our help? Assistance was the word he used, I said. Yeah, assistance, same thing. Anyway, she said, glancing up at the kitchen clock, I better go and get ready for work. Can't hang around here all day looking for secret doors. Then she paused and picked up the envelope. On second thoughts, I'll take this stuff with me to read at lunch and let you know what I find. Later that evening, I was sitting on the floor in one of the spare bedrooms, sorting through boxes, when I heard the front door open. It's me, Rachel shouted from the bottom of the stairs. Mom, where are you? I'm in the back bedroom, I shouted back. In a moment, she appeared at the bedroom door with the old envelope clutched under her arm. All of this stuff, she said, sitting down next to me and handing me the package, relates to our house, this house, and the people that lived here, built it even. I've been looking up some of their names in the archives at work, though it's all a bit strange. Strange? I asked. But did you find out anything about the key? No, still working on that one. I'm not sure what the connection is yet, and how it relates to all this paperwork, but it must have something to do with this house. Or next door, she said. Next door? I asked, confused. Yeah, both our house and next door's house used to be connected. It was one house, one large house, and it had its own name. Let me show you. We had moved downstairs to the kitchen table, and Rachel had spread out the old papers in front of her. So, there's a floor plan of a house, this house, some old newspaper cuttings, some kind of official documents connected to the house or the land that it's built on, and of course the key, she said, picking up one of the musty old pages and handing it to me. Right, I said, glancing at the handwritten script on the page. This doesn't feel like paper. It's got a different texture. That's right, Rachel answered. My colleague Sue in archives says it's vellum. This document is something to do with the sale of land and a house. Can you read it? It's a bit difficult. I'll have a go, I said, running my index finger along the lines of faded handwriting. It says something about the sale of a house called the Old Hall and its lands here at Monk's Ferry. The owner, the seller of the property, is somebody called de Alderville, Radford de Alderville Esquire. What a name. And the purchaser is Mr. Alpheus Pike, shipbuilder. Ah, Messrs. Pike, I exclaimed. Yep, Rachel answered. The surname the crazy man mentioned. Keep reading. So now he's the crazy man, Rachel, honestly, I said, and she gave me a grin. I looked down again at the document. So the house and land was sold to this man, Alpheus Pike, in 1850, and... Rachel waggled another piece of paper at me impatiently. Now read this, she said. This document shows that the Old Hall, as they called it, is actually the empty manor house at the back of our garden, the one next to the church. You know, I saw that mysterious light coming from it last night. It looks like the Pike family moved in, lived there, and then they, almost specifically the Pike sons, Ebenezer and Joseph, built our house in the Hall's orchard sometime later. Ah, right, E and J Pike, I said. just like the inscriptions on our doorstep and on the key. Curious. But what has any of this got to do with us? And how on earth can we assist the people who have given us these documents? I'm guessing they must be relatives of the Pike family from long ago. That I don't know, said Rachel, but there's more, Mum, and it does get a little gruesome. I wanted to hit you with the tame stuff before I showed you the weirder stuff. Gruesome? I said. That sounds a bit worrying. Well, said Rachel, picking up one of the old newspaper clippings. Let me tell you about the murder. Part 2. Miss Elizabeth Pike. At the mention of murder, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Rachel, I don't like the sound of this, I said. Mum, don't worry, it was ages ago, she said. Look, this is something else from the package. A newspaper cutting from the Monk's Ferry Chronicle, with the date 2nd of November, 1872. Rachel smoothed out the old wrinkled newspaper cutting and began to read. Murder at Monk's Ferry. The mysterious death of the only daughter of the late Mr. Alpheus Pike, Esquire, is occupying the attention of the authorities at Monk's Ferry. Miss Elizabeth Pike was found dead last night, All Hallows Even, at approximately 11 o'clock in the evening, in the drawing room of the family residence, the Old Hall at Monk's Ferry. 24-year-old Miss Pike was recently engaged to be wed to the Reverend Charles Griffin, vicar of All Hallows Church in the same town, and a recent engagement ball was held for the family, friends, and local dignitaries at the family's residence. Detective Sergeant Josiah Heath from the Monk's Ferry Constabulary, who was one of the first on the scene, reports that the deceased was found slumped over a sofa with a silk scarf wrapped tightly around her neck, the obvious cause of death being strangulation. There were some signs of struggle, but little evidence could be found of any intruder either on the premises or in the grounds. We are informed that heavy rain that evening had hampered a thorough search of the estate, and we are to believe any evidence has likely been lost. The deceased was discovered by the housekeeper, Mrs. Fogg, who entered the room to attend to the fire grate. When asked why she had not attended to her mistress earlier in the evening, she explained that she had been given firm instructions not to bother Miss Pike or her guests, but that later she had felt compelled to attend to the fire before she retired for the evening. We are told that the identities of the deceased's guests are still unknown, and that there was no other person or persons in the house that evening. An inquest will take place on the 4th of November. Rachel put the clipping down on the floor and looked at me expectantly. "What do you think?" she asked. "Poor young woman," I sighed. "Is there anything else? Did we find out what happened? Was it murder?" "There are more clippings," she answered. "Take a look at this one. It's about the engagement party." I drew the lamp closer to me and read out the date on top of the clipping. 18th of October, 1872. "A couple of weeks before," I said. "Yes," answered Rachel. "It's in the City Mail, so must have been a big event." I began reading aloud. Grand Ball at Monk's Ferry. On Saturday last, a grand ball was held at the Old Hall, Monk's Ferry, to celebrate the engagement of Miss Elizabeth Pike, only daughter of local shipbuilder, the late Mr. Alpheus Pike, Esquire, to the Reverend Charles Griffin, vicar of All Hallows Church, second son of Sir Bertram Griffin, Esquire, and Lady Constance Griffin of London. This most brilliant affair was hosted by Miss Pike's brothers, Mr. Ebenezer Pike and Mr. Joseph Pike, architects of this town. In attendance were the Reverend Griffin's 4 brothers, Lieutenant Cornelius Griffin, Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, Mr. Clarence Griffin, and Mr. Cecil Griffin. At this point, I stopped and looked at Rachel. All the brothers' names begin with the letter C, I laughed. How curious. Rachel nodded and motioned for me to continue. As well as a large circle of the aristocracy and gentry of the neighbourhood, numbering some 100 ladies and gentlemen. The ballroom at the old hall was beautifully decorated with Miss Pike's favourite blooms, the white lily, placed in pleasing positions, accompanied by evergreens and other flowers of all descriptions. Wild red roses adorned the musicians' gallery, and the crests of both the Pike and Griffin families were hung resplendent above that. The supper table was gorgeously laid out in the dining room, and a most magnificent stuffed peacock in full plumage graced the top of the table, which was in turn laid out with the most refined delicacies. We are informed that the peacock is the symbol of the Pike family. Due to the recent death of the cook at the old hall, Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Fogg, from the Merry Monk Inn, provided the victuals at very short notice. The only event that somewhat marred the evening's gaiety was the sudden illness taken by the wife of the Honourable Mr. Arthur Bertram, the Mayor of Monk's Ferry. Fortunately, the Reverend Griffin's brother, Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, was on hand to attend to the lady, and we are informed that Mrs. Bertram recovered fully upon her swift return home. Despite this, dancing and merriment was kept up till a late hour. A most wonderful time was had by all. What a magnificent occasion, I said, putting the newspaper clipping down on the table. I can almost see the beautiful flowers and magnificent ballroom all laid out. But Rachel, I can't bear it. To think that only 2 weeks later it would all end in tragedy. I'm not sure I want to read any more. Rachel picked up the clippings and stuffed them back in the envelope. Mum, it was a long time ago. Elizabeth Pike has been dead for 150 years or something. She's been resting over there in the grave long before even your grandparents were born, she exclaimed, pointing to the churchyard at the back of the house. Even my grandparents, I laughed. Anyway, how do you know where she's buried? I asked. I don't know for sure, Mum, but it makes sense, doesn't it? She said. She was going to marry the vicar dude of the church that's right next to our own house. It's obvious. In fact, I think we should go over there tomorrow and try and find the grave. The vicar dude, I laughed. Rachel, honestly. She grinned at me, and I pushed my chair back with a scrape and stood up. Okay, I'm tired, Rach. It's been another busy day unpacking. Look, I'll take a glance over some more of those papers in the morning. The next morning was bright and sunny. I wandered into the kitchen, and through the back window I caught sight of Rachel outside in wellies and winter coat, poking about in the bushes and fruit trees at the far end of the yard. I knocked on the window to get her attention, and she looked back at me with a beaming smile, waving something above her head that glinted in the sunshine. She mouthed something at me which I didn't understand, so I shrugged, shook my head, and gestured for her to come back inside. The key, she exclaimed, as she came through the back door. I found where the key fits. There's an old wooden gate in the wall at the bottom of the garden. You can't see it because it's hidden behind all the overgrown bushes. Really? I said. I thought we had all the keys for the house. The estate agent never mentioned a garden gate. How on earth did you find it? If I tell you, you'll think I'm a lunatic, she answered, looking down at her feet. Should I ask? I said. I had a restless night again. I had another one of those vivid dreams. I was on the other side of our garden wall, in the grounds of what I think must have been the old hall, and I could see a gate ahead of me. A bright red gate. It was open, and I went through it, and there was a beautiful orchard of fruit trees on the other side. She paused and looked up at me. It was so intense, Mum. The dream, like I was there. There was the sound of buzzing bees and the smell of honey, I interjected, smiling. No, not honey, she exclaimed. Mum, I'm being serious. The smell of, I don't know, a garden in summer. She shrugged and stopped. I knew you'd think I was a lunatic. I reached for her hand and squeezed it. Rach, I'm only kidding. Maybe reading all those old documents is rubbing off on you in some way, affecting your dreams. She pulled her hand away from mine, a little cross. If this is all in my imagination, then how do you explain the fact that the red gate from my dream actually exists and is in exactly the place I thought it would be? I don't know, I said. Maybe it was mentioned in one of those old papers. Look, Rach, let's get some breakfast, and I'll come out and take a look at the gate with you. However you came across it, the gate is there, and I'm curious to see it. Did you manage to open it with the key? I didn't read about it in the old papers, she said stubbornly, and no, I couldn't get the gate open. The key fits, but it doesn't turn all the way. I'm going to need some help. 45 minutes later, and I had donned my own wellies, warm coat and gloves. The sun was still shining, but it disguised the cold of a northern English early November. Rachel had declined breakfast, grabbed a quick cup of tea, and returned to the garden. She was busy pulling away bits of bush and overgrown weeds from the area near the gate with various old gardening tools she must have found in the old shed. I joined her, and soon I could see parts of the worn red wooden gate come into view. See, she said to me, taking out the key from her pocket and brushing away some of the excess weeds around the lock. She placed the key inside the keyhole, and it turned, as she had told me, but seemed to get stuck halfway. We need some WD-40, I said. What the hell is that? Said Rachel, smiling. I laughed. It's a spray, a lubricant. It'll help loosen up the rust inside the lock. There should be some in one of the boxes we brought from our old garage. I returned some minutes later, spray in hand, and after applying it, Rachel tried the key again. This time she was able to turn it without much effort, and we heard a satisfying click. Rachel smiled at me. Good old WD-50 or whatever it's called. Yes, but we still have a bit of a problem, Rach, I said. I can't see a handle or any way of pulling the gate open. Look at this mark in the wood, she replied. There must have been a handle there. She tugged and pulled at the sides of the old wooden gate with her hands, but it wouldn't budge. She sighed in frustration and gave the bottom of the gate a little kick. Do we have a crowbar, Mum? We don't want to destroy it, Rachel, I exclaimed. Look, why don't we leave this for now and go round to the churchyard? You wanted to search for Elizabeth Pike's grave. Yes, OK, let's do that, she said, pulling at the gate again, which still refused to budge. We still need to think of a way of getting this open, though. I know, Rach. I'm sure the mysteries lying behind that gate will still be there when we get back. The entrance to All Hallows Church was just beyond the bend in the road on Monk's Ferry Lane. We walked together through the old covered church gateway and part way down the gravel path towards the ancient stone building. Do you know, said Rachel, turning to me, that gateway we just came through is called a lich gate? No, I didn't, I smiled, and turned my head to look back at the old wooden structure. From what I remember from uni, she said, the word lich is Saxon and meant corpse, and the lich gate was there to protect the coffin or the body from the weather, while the funeral party waited for the vicar, or something like that anyway. Oh, I said, dismayed. I thought it might have a more cheery definition. Rachel rolled her eyes at me. Mum, we're in a graveyard. What did you expect? I thought it might have something to do with weddings, keep the bride dry, something like that, I answered. Rachel laughed. Well, it probably had that use too. We stopped halfway down the path and looked around. In the far distance, somebody with a very small dog on a lead was placing flowers at a grave. But other than that, it was empty and silent. Gravestones of every description could be seen dotted around the church building, and some older areas were quite overgrown. Rach, this is going to be a bit of a needle in a haystack search, isn't it? We have no idea where Elizabeth Pike would have been buried, I said. Well, you say that, she answered, but we know that Elizabeth died in 1872 and that she was from a distinguished family from the old hall. So let's start over there in the older section and look for some kind of grand arrangement of graves or a family plot or something. Why don't you start at one end and I'll start at the other? In the really overgrown bit, I said despondently. Rachel shrugged and smiled and headed off in the direction of the old hall, which we could see peeking out of the trees beyond one of the church's stone boundary walls. I set off down a smaller gravel-covered path towards the back of the church. Good job you've got your wellies on, she shouted after me. I searched and searched in the long wet grass for what seemed like an age. I was just about to give up because the cold was seeping through my wellies and into my toes when I heard Rachel shout at the top of her lungs, Mum, found it! She was waving at me frantically from an area close to the stone boundary wall. When I reached her, she was hunched down and brushing off debris from the surface of a dirty white marble gravestone with her hands. She looked up at me. She's here, she said. I was just about to call it a day, Rach. Can you read the inscription? I asked, trying to get a little closer to the overgrown grave. Yes, just about, she said. It says, Here lies the body of fair Elizabeth Pike, mistress of the old hall, loving and only sister of Ebenezer and Joseph, taken from this mortal life on Hallows Even, October 1872, aged 24 years. Sweet sister, high-born, in spirit and in virtue, she lived and she laughed and she loved. Short was her stay in this world, cruelly stolen from our sight. Now residing between the earth and the heavens, we shall not rest until her soul is freed. Gosh, that's unusual. We will not rest, I said, looking down at Rachel, who was brushing more weeds and dirt away from the bottom of the grave. Until her soul is freed, she finished, turning her head to look up at me. Do you think that's what we have to do, Mum? Help to free her soul? I frowned. Hold on. Seriously, Rach? And how would we do that precisely? We know nothing about what happened to this poor young woman after she was murdered. I mean, we don't even know if it was murder, and even if it was, perhaps they caught the perpetrator years later, or sooner. As you said to me, she's been lying in this grave for 150 years. Why would the family, the descendants of the family, contact us now with bits of old documents and a key? What do we have to do with it? It's ridiculous. Rachel stood up abruptly and stared straight at me. You're impossible sometimes, she exclaimed. You're not the one who's been having all the stupid dreams. She was murdered. I don't know why I know that, but I do. And what other assistance could we give to these people, this family, if it wasn't to find out who her murderer was, so that they can all rest in peace? It says so on the grave. She stopped and we both looked at each other. "Rachel, do you hear what you're saying?" I answered, as calmly as I could after her sudden outburst. "A random stranger brings an envelope to our front door on a rainy Halloween evening, and all of a sudden we become ghost hunters." "I said you're impossible," she furiously shouted, standing up and striding off in a huff towards the gravel path and the exit to the graveyard. I watched her slip away under the cemetery lich gate, and she was gone. I pursed my lips and sighed. I was confused and concerned. What had provoked the outburst in this ridiculous idea? It was probably best to leave her to calm down a little bit. If I knew my daughter as well as I hoped I did, she'd have cooled off by the time I got back home. I looked down at the marble gravestone and realised that Rachel hadn't read out all the inscription that she'd uncovered at the bottom of the stone. I hunched down and read to myself. "Also laid in this ground, Ebenezer Alpheus Pike of Hallows House, who died suddenly 5th of September 1911, aged 68 years. Also, Joseph Pike of Hallows House, who died tragically at sea, aged 77 years, on the 7th of May, 1920. Death shall not quench the search for truth." "Tragic story, that," said a man's voice from behind me. Startled, I stood up from my crouched position and turned to face the direction of the voice. I realised it was the person with the dog that I'd seen bent over a gravestone when we first entered the graveyard. "Didn't mean to make you jump," he said. "I heard a bit of shouting and thought I'd best come over. See if you needed any help." "Oh, nothing. I'm fine. We're fine," I answered awkwardly. "But thanks for your concern. I come out here most days. It's the missus, you see, over there." He pointed back towards the gravestone he'd been tending. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. "No need," he replied plainly. We stood in a bit of awkward silence. I cleared my throat. "You said something about a tragic story," I asked, pointing at the Pike family's grave. "Oh yes, tragic," he repeated. He turned and looked over towards the derelict manor house beyond the boundary of the graveyard. "My great-grandfather Albert was brought up in that old house when the Pikes lived there. Grand place at the time, mind. Not now, though. He would have been about 14 years of age when the mistress was murdered." "The mistress?" I asked. "You mean Elizabeth Pike?" "Yes," he answered. "Although locals knew her as Lizzie, of course. Kind woman from all accounts. Her portrait hangs in Monk's Ferry Library, in the archives reading room, if I'm not mistaken. Think her father, too, Alpheus. Bit of a philanthropist around these parts, he was." "Oh," I said, surprised. "My daughter works there, in the library, part-time." He didn't respond, and we stood in another awkward silence again. I wasn't completely sure he'd heard me. Then, without my prompting, he began to speak again. "She was murdered, you know, in her own home. My great-grandfather Albert, did I tell you that, was at the funeral. His mother was housekeeper at the old hall. All the town came out. Tragic." He paused to reach down to ruffle the top of the tiny dog's head before continuing. "After that, the brothers, they're buried here with her, you know, were by all accounts heartbroken. Couldn't live in the old hall any longer. Haunted by something, they say. Her memory, maybe. Some say her ghost. But I don't believe in those things." He paused again, and I was just about to speak when he continued. "Which is why they built that house over there. They called it Hallows House. Moved in, and the old hall eventually went to rack and ruin. Nobody would have it." He pointed to the roof of our house, which you could see poking out above the trees and overgrown bushes. That's my house, I said. I live there, or at least in one half of it. Aye, he said. Been empty for a while. That part at least, he answered. Yes, we only moved in a week ago. That is, my daughter and I. We had no idea that it had been one house until the past couple of days. Do you know why they split the house into two? After the brothers died, he answered, neither wed. There were no descendants, you see. Hallows House was sold, as was the old hall. 1920s, I think. My father would remember it if he were alive. I nodded. So whoever bought Hallows House divided it into two. He nodded back and stamped his feet against the cold. Anyway, must be getting along, he said, and picked up the tiny dog in his arms. Thank you for the information, I said as he began to walk away. Nice to meet you. He made no reply, but just as he was halfway down the cemetery path, he turned back and shouted over to me. They say there are ancient underground passages about this place, all the way from the old hall down to the priory and the river. I'm Stanley Fogg, and this is Bella. He pointed at the dog in his arms. If you want to know any more, I'm at Catlow Cottages, number 2, just ring the bell. I waved in acknowledgement and shouted, thanks, back to him. When I got back home, I went through to the kitchen and put the kettle on. My hands were freezing despite wearing gloves. I lit the large fire and settled into the wooden rocking chair at the side of the fireplace. A hot mug of steaming tea was a welcome relief from the cold and damp outside. I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and Rachel came into the kitchen with the old brown envelope under her arm. She threw herself down on the comfy chair opposite me. Mum, I'm an idiot, she said, looking at me and sighing. You're absolutely right. This is ridiculous. I'm ridiculous. I don't know what's got into me. I think I'm just tired. The move and everything, maybe. You're right. What does any of this have to do with us? We should probably keep the key, but this stuff should go on the fire. She was just about to throw the package and its entire contents onto the now roaring fire when I quickly intervened. No, Rachel, I said. Don't do that. I don't know what's going on either, but what I do know is that I'd still like to find out more. Are you sure? She asked, holding the envelope still precariously close to the fire. Yes, I am, I answered. First things first, we should go to the library and visit Miss Elizabeth Pike. Part 3. The Library. The library was situated on Brewery Lane, just opposite the Merry Monk Inn. This was quite a favourable arrangement according to Rachel, who had spent a number of her own merry lunchtimes in the old beer house with some of her library colleagues. It was Saturday morning, and we were having a quick breakfast at Fogg's Cafe a bit further up the road. It was a bit of a greasy spoon affair, but they made wonderful cakes and pastries, and I still hadn't satisfied my cake craving after watching an episode of the Bake Off the other evening. While tucking into a gloriously sticky Danish pastry, I noticed that Rachel seemed distracted. She was looking at an old map of the town on the wall next to us and paying little attention to her own Danish pastry, which had a larger cherry on the top than mine. Rach, I asked, are you going to eat that? She completely ignored my question and instead asked one of her own. Mum, have you noticed that there are a lot of fogs in this town? The place is full of them. Fog, I answered, bewildered. You mean like mist? No, she answered, a little irritated. Fogs. Fog with 2 G's. The family. We're in Fogg's Cafe, and further down the road there's a Fogg and Sons Butchers, and I'm pretty sure we passed a chemist with the name G. Fogg over the door. Honestly, Rachel, I hadn't noticed. But now you point it out, I suppose you're right. But then, you do know the town a lot better than I do, I said, taking another bite of my Danish pastry. Also, she continued, wasn't the old man with the dog in the cemetery yesterday a fog too? I'd filled Rachel in yesterday with all the details about my encounter with Stanley and his little dog after she'd left the graveyard. Yes, true, I said, with a mouthful of pastry. And we know now that his great-great-grandmother, who was the housekeeper at the old hall at the time of Elizabeth Pike's death, was the person who found her body. I nodded in agreement. She paused and then continued. And there was a mention of another couple of fogs in one of the old newspaper clippings. Was there? I asked, trying to remember. Rachel reached into her shopping bag and pulled out the old brown envelope that the stranger had given us. She took out the newspaper clippings from the packet and found the one in question. Yes, she said, scanning the print with her index finger. Mr. and Mrs. Elijah Fogg. They provided the food for the engagement ball, and they were landlords at the Merry Monk Inn too. I nodded again. But I suppose there are lots of family names that still linger about in all small British towns. It's not that unusual. She said. I wonder if the family still run the pub. Seems unlikely after all this time. I shrugged and took a last bite of my pastry. Rachel shuffled through the newspaper clippings. Anyway, would you like me to read another of these newspaper reports before we go into the library? She asked. Okay, I said, taking a sip of my cappuccino. Let's look at Elizabeth Pike's funeral, if that's not too morbid a subject on a sunny Saturday morning. Well, it's all pretty morbid, Rachel, I laughed. And don't let that pastry go to waste, I added. She rolled her eyes at me, smiled and took a large, deliberate bite of the Danish. Wiping her mouth and hands on the paper napkin beside her, she smoothed the clipping out onto the table. This is from the Monk's Ferry Journal, she said, the Saturday edition, from the 4th of November, 1872. It says, Murder at Monk's Ferry. Funeral of Miss Elizabeth Pike. The funeral of Miss Elizabeth Pike, aged 24, who was murdered in her home, the Old Hall, last week, on the evening of the 31st of October, took place on Friday morning. The interment being in the cemetery of All Hallows Church in this town. The Reverend Charles Griffin, vicar of All Hallows, who recently became engaged to be married to the ill-fated lady, took the sombre service. The time of the ceremony was amended to the early morning, at the last minute, to avoid the attendance of a large crowd. However, a large group of spectators from the town did attend, and were seen huddled under the cemetery lich gate, seemingly undeterred by the vicious storm that was then passing overhead. The coffin containing the corpse of Miss Pike had lain in the Monk's Ferry mortuary since the night of the murder, and then handed over to Mr. S. Fogg, undertaker. At this point, Rachel looked up at me from her reading and exclaimed in disbelief, Another Fogg! Mum, these people get around. I nodded and smiled, and she continued. Accordingly, at 9:15 on Friday morning, a mourning coach, driven by 2 white horses with black plumes and bearing the Pike family crest, arrived at the cemetery. The crowd of spectators from the town were moved away reluctantly from the cover of the lich gate to allow the coffin bearers to enter the graveyard. The coffin was followed to the main entrance of the church by the chief mourners, the brothers of the deceased, Mr. Ebenezer Pike, Esquire, and Mr. Joseph Pike, Esquire, Mr. Richard Pike, Esquire, the deceased's uncle, Mr. Josiah Bell, Esquire, former business partner of the deceased's father, Mr. Alpheus Pike, and some members of the Reverend Griffin's family. These were followed by various servants of the old hall, including Mr. Sylvester Scullion, house steward, Mr. Donald Chaplin, butler, Mrs. Fogg, housekeeper, and various footmen and maids. The mayor of Monk's Ferry, who had attended Miss Pike's engagement ball with his wife last month, was not in attendance, since Mrs. Bertram had been struck down once again by a sudden mystery illness. As already reported, the service was conducted by the deceased's former fiancé, the Reverend Charles Griffin, who began by addressing the mourners there in attendance, beseeching them to recognise the special solemnity of the occasion, that death under favoured circumstances was painful, but that the occasion of this death was intensely so. The reverend gentleman then offered a reading from the 1 Corinthians 15, taken from the 19th verse. After this, the reverend spoke of his own personal sorrow and the moment of intense sin which had cruelly snatched from his reach and those of the mourners there present, a future wife, a sister and friend. As the reverend began to pray for those present to be comforted, a commotion was heard at the back of the church, and an unknown woman was seen shouting and flaying her arms about in a wild and dramatic manner. 2 policemen from the Monk's Ferry Constabulary, who were in attendance at the entrance to the church, were seen to restrain the woman and remove her quickly from the scene. Her identity is unknown. Apart from this strange incident, the service was a deeply affecting one, and the spectators outside the church, who were now many in number, despite the heavy rain, were most orderly. "The paper is ripped at the bottom," said Rachel as she finished reading, "and so it ends a bit abruptly." "It's all very sad, Rach," I said. "But who was the woman flaying her arms about at the end? What on earth do you suppose that was all about?" "I suppose we may never know," she answered, taking another large bite of pastry. Then she paused and looked down at the newspaper clipping in her hand. "But we have to try and find out more, Mum. I don't know what this compulsion is within me to want to know more. I just know it's there." We finished our coffees and wandered down the road to the imposing mid-Victorian building which housed the library and archives of Monk's Ferry. A date over the doorway, carved in pale stone, read, "Free Library, 1865. Once inside, Rachel directed me across the decorative Minton-tiled floor, up the grand central staircase with its elaborately carved handrails, and to the right, up a second flight of stairs, towards a large set of double doors with large brass handles. "What a beautiful place," I said, glancing at Rachel, as she pulled open one of the heavy doors and motioned me inside. She pointed over to the far end of the large room, with its huge sash windows, great oak tables and bookcases. "There's Sue," she said, and waved. Sue waved back. She was a petite woman in her late 40s, at least that was my guess. She wore her long black hair in chunky braids, and as she approached us, I could see that she also had a little pair of silver-rimmed glasses on the end of her nose. "Hey, Rach, I'm surprised to see you here on your day off," she exclaimed. Rachel smiled. "We've come to check something out. Sue, this is Mum. Mum, this is Sue." I said hello and went to shake Sue's hand, realising a bit too late that both of her arms were fully encumbered with books. "Let me put these down," she said, placing the books carefully on one of the oak tables nearby. "Lovely to meet you," she said. "Rachel tells me you've just moved to the area. How can I help?" "Oh, well, we were looking for a Victorian painting, actually, rather than a book. I was told there was a large one of a young woman here. Her name was Elizabeth Pike. And the painting is supposed to be in the reading room. There should be one of her father too, I answered, looking around expectantly at the wood-panelled walls. I was a bit confused though, Sue, when Mum told me, said Rachel, because I don't recall seeing any paintings like that in this room or anywhere else in the library, come to that. Ah, yes, said Sue. They do exist, but they were taken down in the 1970s, I believe. Actually, we do have a number of large paintings of the founder and benefactors of the library down in the stores. The founder, I said. Yes, Alpheus Pike. Founded the library in 1865. You might have seen the date carved above the front door as you came in. Of course. That's why their portraits are here, said Rachel. I had no idea that the Pike family were connected with the library. Now it makes sense. Mum and I are trying to find out more about the family. Can we go down to the stores, Sue? Yes, said Sue. Give me a minute, and I'll get the keys and the collections register. The library stores were in the basement of the old building. Down 2 flights of stone steps, another large, heavy wooden door opened into a narrow, dark room lined on both sides with modern metal shelving. Paintings of all shapes and sizes, both framed and unframed, were stacked vertically in rows. Sue turned on the fluorescent tube lighting and began cross-checking the handwritten shelf labels with the large inventory register in her hands. She stopped at the end of the room and motioned us to join her. So here is Alpheus Pike, she said, handing Rachel a large book and pulling out the metal shelf to its full length with a tug. A large gilt-framed oil painting of a distinguished middle-aged bearded man sitting at a wooden desk in a dimly lit wood-panelled room appeared before us. He was formally dressed in a dark frock coat, and next to him a large wolfhound rested its head on his right knee. He has kind eyes, said Rachel. The dog or the man, I quipped. Rachel rolled her eyes at me and took out her mobile phone. Sue, can I take a photograph of this? Yes, no problem, answered Sue. Would you like to see the painting of his daughter? Absolutely, I said. Rachel suddenly chipped in excitedly. Mum, that's our grandfather clock. She was pointing to a tall clock in the painting, which was leaning against the wooden panelling to the left of Alpheus Pike. No, I exclaimed. Really? Are you sure? Yes, definitely. I'd recognise that monstrosity anywhere, she exclaimed. I leaned forward to take a closer look. She was right. There was the same clock that was currently sitting in the hallway of our house. How extraordinary, I said. Sue, how old is this painting? Do you know? Sue took back the register from Rachel and scanned the entries with her finger. It says here 1868. Not sure we know who the artist was. The notes say that it was painted some months before his death. So the room that he's sitting in is probably somewhere in the old hall, said Rachel. Where they lived? Perhaps, said Sue, although it could have been anywhere really. The offices of Pike and Bell Shipping, maybe, which was situated a bit further up the river in Myrtleton. Pike and Bell Shipping? I asked. Yes, it's how Alpheus Pike made his fortune. I suppose they would have called it new money back then. I believe he was pretty broke when he came across to Monk's Ferry from Dublin in the 1830s, she answered. I got the impression the Pikes were one of those ancient families, you know, part of the old nobility, said Rachel, surprised. I think one of the old newspaper clippings we have talks about them having a family crest or something. Yeah, said Sue. Probably a made-up crest, though, a 19th century invention, to give the impression that the Pike family were just that, part of the landed gentry. Curious, I said. Let's take a look at Elizabeth Pike. Sue pulled out the taller painting directly behind the one of Alpheus Pike. Rachel and I gasped when we saw the full-length figure of an elegant young woman in a long silk peacock blue dress come into view. Elizabeth Pike was standing almost sideways on, so that only one half of her face was on view. She was staring solemnly into a large gilt mirror on the wall of a grand room, with luscious rose-red flocked wallpaper and a heavily polished wooden floor. However, because of the angle of the mirror, only the back wall and window of the grand room could be seen in the mirror's reflection. "It's you!" I exclaimed, looking at Rachel and back at the painting. Rachel was staring intently at the figure in the painting with her mouth slightly open in astonishment. "We even have the same hair colour," she murmured slowly. Sue looked a little dumbfounded too. "I haven't looked at this painting in a long, long time," she said. "But yes, she does look like you, Rachel. How bizarre." "Okay, this is a little creepy," said Rachel with a nervous laugh. "What does she have in her hand?" I asked, gazing back at the painting. Sue looked a little closer. "Well, she has her left hand on her hip, so you can't see it very well, but in her right she's holding a silk scarf and some keys." "5 keys," said Rachel, "on a brass ring." Then looking at me said, "Hell, Mum, that can't be the same scarf that they found round her neck," I finished. "They found around her neck?" exclaimed Sue, scrunching her eyes up and moving closer to the painting. "What do you mean?" Rachel stepped back from the picture. "It can't be. We're overthinking this because we're a little weirded out right now. But one of the newspaper reports of her murder states that she was strangled with a silk scarf." "Well, I read that she died in suspicious circumstances," said Sue, "but the book doesn't go into that much detail." "The book?" said Rachel and I in unison. Yeah," said Sue, a little bemused by our joint eagerness. "The history of the old hall. It's one of a volume of 10 from a history of Monk's Ferry. 19th century, I think. We have it up in collections. I think it was written by a Reverend Griffin, Charles Griffin, I believe." "Elizabeth Pike's betrothed!" exclaimed Rachel. "This I need to see." Part 4. The Clock. After Rachel had taken a couple of snaps on her phone of both paintings, we followed Sue back up to the reading room. She was sat at one of the oak tables with a large leather-bound book in front of her. "So here it is," she said, as we sat down next to her. She carefully turned over the heavy front cover and traced her finger slowly down the first page of text. So the book was published in 1901 by Clarence Griffin and Son Limited, publishers of London. "Clarence Griffin," I said. "Another Griffin, a brother of the Reverend, perhaps." "We've heard that name before, Mum," said Rachel, reaching into her shopping bag and pulling out the brown envelope. She sifted through the various papers inside and brought out the newspaper report of Elizabeth Pike's engagement ball. "Yes," she continued, "the 4 brothers of the Reverend Charles, all attended the grand ball. Remember, Mum, you noted how all the brothers' names began with a C." Yes, I did," I said. "Remind me who they were again." "Okay, so we have Lieutenant Cornelius Griffin, must have been in the army, presumably. Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, a medical man. It says he attended to the lady who took ill on the evening, and here we go, Clarence Griffin. So we know now that he was a book publisher, or at least became one. Then the last brother is Cecil Griffin, but no more clues about him." Sue cut across. Well, I think I may have your last Griffin brother's occupation here. She pushed the heavy book towards Rachel. Look at the frontispiece. It's a rather lovely painting of the old hall, by Cecil Griffin, Esquire. Wow, he was an artist then, said Rachel, staring at the picture. Sue nodded and pushed back her chair. Presumably, she said. Look, you take the book, and I'll go and retrieve my collections register. See if we have anything here in the stacks by Cecil Griffin. Thanks, Sue, I said, as she wandered away. I looked over at Rachel, who was now leafing through the hefty volume. You know, Mum, she said, as she flipped through the pages, I need to start making notes. This is getting complicated. All these names, family connections, possible murderers. With that, she looked up at me and grinned. It was me who rolled my eyes this time. Yes, you should, I said. It'd be easier to keep track of... Mum, said Rachel, interrupting suddenly. There's a short bit here in the back about our house. Oh, wow, I answered. What does it say? Well, first of all, there's a drawing of it. Look. She turned the open book towards me, and I peered at the image of the house, our house. It's a lot grander looking here, I said, smiling. How fascinating, though. Yes, it was obviously drawn when it was all one house. But look, Mum, the front door in the picture is our front door. Next door's entrance must have been added later. What does it say underneath? I asked. Rachel turned the book back around to face her. It says, Hallows House, Orchard Road, Monk's Ferry, 1900, drawn by Cecil Griffin, Esquire. Another picture by Cecil, I said. Did he do all the illustrations in this book? Not sure, said Rachel, continuing to read. Hallows House, built in the grounds of the old hall in 1873 by Ebenezer and Joseph Pike after the death of their sister Elizabeth. A dedication stone to her memory can be found on the 17th century fountain, which originally stood in the orchard of the old hall and now forms part of the Hallows House estate. Estate? I exclaimed. We only have a small back garden, and I haven't seen a fountain. I wonder if it's next door. It must be, said Rachel, looking up. Have you met our neighbours yet? No, not yet. I haven't seen anybody next door, coming or going. Have you? I asked. I did see an old guy going into number 7 the other day. We should probably invite him around for tea, make his acquaintance, I said. For tea? Rachel laughed. Mum, you sound like you're from the 19th century yourself. What's wrong with tea? I laughed. I'll make cake. Rachel grinned. Well, one way or another, we need to speak to him. He might know more about the history of the house and the fountain. I'd love to see that. I nodded in agreement, and Rachel continued to read. The house is currently occupied by the Messrs. Pike and retains a grand drawing room, library, other small reception rooms, 7 bedrooms, servants' quarters, and wine cellar. Rachel looked up again. Mum, we have a wine cellar, she said. No, I answered, smiling. We might have a wine cellar. That also might be next door. It'll be just our luck if the neighbour has all the best bits, said Rachel glumly. I laughed. Well, we know we have the grand drawing room at least, I said, even if it isn't as grand as it used to be. Rachel smiled and returned to the book. Well, that's pretty much all it says about the house, really. She turned the next page slowly, and out fell a loose piece of paper which dropped fluttering to the floor. Rachel bent over and picked it up. Anything interesting? I asked. Some kind of handwritten notes or something, she said. Oh, actually this is interesting. It looks as though somebody was here before us, looking at this book and doing some of their own research on our house. I'll see if I can read it. The writing's a bit small and disjointed. It says, Hallows House inherited by Sylvester Scullion after death of Pike brothers, 1920. Now there's another name that rings a bell, I intervened. Rachel rummaged in the brown parcel again and brought out another newspaper clipping. I think he was at Elizabeth's funeral, said Rachel, scanning the report. Yep, here it is. Servants of the old hall, including Mr. Sylvester Scullion, house steward. House steward, I said, and he inherited Hallows House, all of it. Well, he must have got on well with them, I laughed, and Rachel nodded in agreement. I suppose, since the brothers didn't marry, there were no children to inherit the house. In fact, no descendants, not even any nieces and nephews, said Rachel. So I wonder if he got everything. Scullion, I mean. All their property, including the old hall and the grounds. Do the notes say anything about it? I asked. Not that I can see, said Rachel, reading. It's a bit disjointed, but it goes on to say, H. House, divided 1921. Scullion family reside, number 9. Other side rented. Current occupant of number 9, Beatrice Scullion, niece. Interesting, I said. Are those notes dated by any chance? Rachel turned the paper over. Well, kind of, she laughed. She passed the paper to me and I smiled. The notes had been written on the back of a flyer for a local cafe, Fogg's Cafe, where we had had our Danish pastries this morning. In the advert, the cafe were enticing local diners to grab a great British breakfast at Fogg's for under a £5. Limited offer, closes end November 2017. I told you, Mum, those Fogg's get everywhere, said Rachel. At least we can be pretty certain that whoever wrote these notes did so a year ago. And that Beatrice Scullion was almost certainly the last occupant of our house before us, I added. And that the note-taker, whoever he or she was, had a blooming good breakfast, added Rachel, laughing. At that moment, Sue returned with the collections register under her arm. You both sound as though you're enjoying your research, she said, smiling. Oops, said Rachel. Hope we're not being too loud. It's just that everywhere we go, we're finding references to the name Fogg. We've just found this flyer in the book. She passed it to Sue, who took a look. Ah, she said. The cafe opposite. Nice cakes. She passed the flyer back to Rachel. Keep it if the notes on the back are useful. Thanks, will do, said Rachel. Sue sat down and opened her collections register, which she'd bookmarked with a few scraps of paper. Well, she said, we do hold a number of items by the artist Cecil Griffin. I think the first one will be particularly interesting to you. The oil portrait of Elizabeth Pike that we've just viewed downstairs was painted by Cecil and is dated December 1872. Wow, said Rachel. That's only a few weeks after she died. Right, said Sue. Although it is more likely that the portrait was begun before her death, perhaps to mark a special occasion. It looks to me as though it was modelled from life. Also, these paintings could take months to complete. Meaning that he finished it after her death? I asked. Yes, I think that seems probable, she answered. Her engagement, said Rachel suddenly. That has to be the special occasion you're talking about. Her impending wedding to Cecil's brother, the Reverend Charles. How sad that she never saw it completed, I added. We sat quietly for a few moments pondering the thought. So, said Sue, breaking the silence, we also have a few other things. A sketchbook, a couple of journals, and a few loose drawings. You might want to see them. Journals, exclaimed Rachel. Now that could be very interesting. There might be something in there about Elizabeth's death. It's possible, said Sue, looking at the dates in the register. They loosely cover the period from 1871 up to 1901, when, according to the notes here, he died. Would you like me to get them? Yes, definitely, answered Rachel. I checked my watch. Look, Rach, I'm going to leave you to get on with this, I said. I really should be getting back to the house. The plumber is coming round to connect the washing machine about 2. Yeah, sure, Mum. I'll see you later, she said. I said my goodbyes to Sue and left the library. I wandered back through the town and around past Catlow Cottages, where Stanley Fogg had told me he lived. I thought about knocking at number 2, Stanley's home, for that chat he'd offered me, but thought better of it. The plumber came first. The chat could wait. I then made my way down Orchard Road and stood for a little while outside our new home, taking in the house with fresh eyes and musing on the information we'd learned about the former Hallows House. The wind had picked up, and I was just about to go in when the door of number 7 opened and an elderly man wrapped in a thick overcoat came out. He turned and acknowledged my presence with a nod. Hello, I said. I'm your new neighbour. I know, he answered, somewhat bluntly. My name is, I began, but he waved his hand at me impatiently. I don't wish to be rude, but I'm in a hurry, he said, locking his front door and turning to walk down his garden path. Oh, yes, of course, sorry, I said, wondering in the back of my mind why I was apologising. As he was walking down the road away from me, I had a sudden thought and shouted after him. Would you like to come to tea tomorrow afternoon? I have cake. He completely ignored me and carried on walking, and I felt a bit of an idiot for asking. Then all of a sudden, as I was about to enter my own front door, he turned and shouted back, Will it be Bakewell Tart? A bit flummoxed, I replied back, Yes, I suppose. Then I'll be there about 3, he answered, turning and continuing hurriedly on his journey. A few hours later, I received a text on my phone from Rachel, who said that she was going for a meal and drinks with her library colleagues and would probably be back late. I text back a, no probs, see you later, Mum, kiss, and settled myself in for the evening. All was dark outside, and I closed the curtains, turned the television on low, curled up on the sofa, and picked up a home design magazine. I was leafing through the pages, looking for ways of sprucing up the place, when all of a sudden I was startled by a loud chiming sound coming from the hallway. That blooming clock, I cried out loud to nobody in particular. It was only the second time I'd been aware of it making any sound, the first being 3 days ago, on the evening the stranger had arrived at our front door. I threw my magazine on the coffee table and stood up, determined this time to try and turn it off, mute it, or whatever you were supposed to do with these things. I switched on the hallway light and looked at the clock. It was quite imposing, about 7 foot tall, heavy, and made out of a dark reddish wood that looked like mahogany. It had a square brass face, which was obscured by a dirty glass door, and underneath that a long wooden door, which I presumed held its workings. I realised that I was going to need a torch if I was going to investigate further, and went through to the kitchen. Another loud bong made me jump, and I grabbed the torch from the under-sink cupboard and went to face the clock. Using the torch, I could see more clearly the detail in the fine wooden carving. Despite my annoyance, I had to be honest, it really was a beautifully made thing. At the top were 2 carved wooden scrolls, like swans' necks. and in the middle of that a roaring lion's head, complete with mane and teeth, and a couple of carved roses above that. There were other decorative designs carved into the wood, but I would need a chair to get a better look at them. Standing precariously atop the kitchen chair with a torch in my mouth, I opened the glass door protecting the brass clock face. Underneath the fancy hour and minute hands were the decoratively inscribed words Daniel O'Neill, Dublin, and the year 1757. Well, look at that, I said to the clock. I had no idea you were that old. It didn't reply, which I was grateful for. It had already half scared me to death twice this evening. Above this were 2 holes which I deduced had something to do with the winding mechanism. If that was the case, then why was the clock still making loud bonging sounds every now and then? It can't have been wound up for a long time. I decided that it was obviously faulty. I was just about to get down from the chair when the front door suddenly opened and a rush of cold air entered the hallway. I jumped again. "Mum, what on earth are you doing up there?" It was Rachel. "Hell, Rach, I've had enough shocks tonight. Do you have to come in like that?" I said. "Like what?" she asked, looking perplexed. "I mean, do you have to be so loud?" "Never mind. Anyway, I thought you were going to be late." "Yeah, me too. Doreen had a migraine, so we decided to call it a day," she answered. "Mum, what are you doing up there?" I got down from the chair and carried it back into the kitchen. Rachel followed me, still waiting for an answer. "Oh, I was trying to turn the clock off. It went off again a couple of times before, scared me half to death," I said, as she began removing her coat. "Turn it off?" she asked. "Is it possible to turn off a wind-up clock?" "Rachel, I have no idea," I answered. "I was trying to work that out." "Have you opened up the pendulum case?" she asked. "Since when did you become an expert in 18th century clocks?" I said. "I'm only trying to help, Mum," she said irritatedly. "There might be something in there, a switch or something." She took my torch, bent down and used it to peer closely at the tiny lock in the pendulum case door. "Well, it's locked," she said, looking up at me. Then, with a mischievous grin, she added, "However, the key is in the lock, which means it won't stay locked for much longer." "Rachel, seriously, my nerves are stretched," I scolded. "Just open the damn thing and let's see if we can turn it off before we go to bed." "Mum, chill, seriously," said Rachel, as she turned the tiny brass key in the lock. The lock made a satisfying click, and the door opened. She peered inside. The torch picked up 2 long brass pendulums, which looked as though they hadn't moved for many years. Apart from that, the cabinet was empty. The only other thing of note was a distinctly musty odour emanating from inside. "Smells," said Rachel, holding her nose. "Poke about a bit with your hand," I said. "See if there's anything else in there." She screwed up her face and tentatively placed one hand inside the clock. "There might be spiders," she said suddenly, screwing up her face. "Well, they'll all be dead spiders by now. I don't think this clock has been opened for a long time, if the smell is anything to go by." "That doesn't reassure me," said Rachel, but she carried on with her careful investigation anyway. "Anything?" I asked after a minute. "Actually, there is something here, at the bottom," she answered. "It's not a switch or anything, but there's something sticking up. A bit of wood. Like a tiny handle. Let me pull it. In fact, Mum, can you hold the torch so that I can get a good grip on this?" I took the torch and shone it downwards. Rachel tugged on the piece of raised wood, and a small panel came away in her hands, revealing a hidden space below. "This is probably where all the spiders are congregated," she said, wincing. I stood silently, with the torch focused on the secret compartment, as Rachel reached in again and began to pull out what looked like some old bound documents. She stood up with the bundle in her hands, and we both looked at it and then at each other. I shone the torch on the top of the pile, and Rachel read out the words written in a fine decorative hand on the cardboard cover. Property of Miss Beatrice Scullion. Confidential. Part 5. Beatrice Scullion. We sat in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee and a half-empty packet of chocolate digestives that I'd left out for the plumber earlier that afternoon. The newly discovered pile of documents, still held together with a dirty piece of reddish ribbon, sat next to Rachel on the table. Deep in thought, she absent-mindedly twisted one of the ends of ribbon with her fingers, and then looked up at me. "Digestive?" I said, offering her the open packet. She took one, snapped it in 2, and put both pieces down on the table next to her coffee, without eating either. "Beatrice Scullion," she murmured, pursing her lips. "She was the lady who lived here before us," I offered. Rachel nodded and I continued. "What did we learn today? That she was the daughter of the house steward at the old hall, the man who inherited Hallows House from the Pikes. Sylvester, was that his first name?" "Yes, Sylvester Scullion. But she was his niece, not his daughter," said Rachel, correcting me. After a pause, she continued. Pointing at the bundle of papers, she said, "I wonder how long this stuff has been hidden inside that clock." "From the looks of it, quite a while," I answered. Rachel lifted one of the pieces of biscuit to her mouth, then paused before it reached her lips. "I'm just trying to get my head around this, Mum," she said, wafting the piece of biscuit in the air. "I have a lot of information swirling around in my head from all the stuff I read this afternoon at the library." "Well, if it helps, let's start writing it down," I offered, getting up and grabbing a lined notebook and pen from the top of an unopened packing box before we open up this new pile of documents. "This new can of worms," she said under her breath. She stopped waving the biscuit around and popped it into her mouth with a crunch. "You know, Mum," she said with a full mouth, "we still haven't sorted out the problem with the clock." "Not necessarily. We might have jolted it into submission," I smiled. "Anyway, I can't understand how it was still making bonging sounds when it obviously hadn't been wound for ages." Rachel nodded in agreement and then reached into her pocket and brought out her mobile phone. She fiddled with it for a second and then turned it to face me. "This is the picture I took of the Alpheus Pike portrait in the library," she said. I looked, and she enlarged the digital image with 2 fingers. "See, the clock in the painting is definitely the same as ours." I took her phone and made the image even larger, focusing in on the various details of the clock, which stood behind the seated figure of Alpheus in the corner of the unknown room. "Yes, the same square brass face, the carved lion head, the roses, everything is the same," I said. "Which means," said Rachel, "that Sylvester Scullion must have inherited some or all of the contents of Hallows House from the Pikes, including this clock. And it's remained here ever since," I added. "And then presumably it was inherited by his niece, Beatrice. I wonder when she came to live here," she said. "These papers may offer us a clue," I suggested. "True," said Rachel. She paused and then picked up the second piece of biscuit. "Mum, was anything else left here? Other bits of old furniture, I mean, apart from the clock?" "No," I answered. "Well, I suppose all the old curtains and some of the light fittings were left behind, but that's it." "Why was the clock not removed?" asked Rachel. "Well, the executors of the estate, who I never met, asked me via my solicitor whether I'd like to keep it. They said it was too old and heavy to move safely, so I said I didn't mind. With hindsight, if I'd known it was going to be so annoying, I'd have asked them to take it away. I laughed. Rachel smiled, and I took a sip of coffee and a bite of my own biscuit and picked up the lined pad in front of me. Rachel reached over and put the pile of bound papers on her lap. "Okay, let's open this up and find out what was so confidential that Beatrice Scullion had to stash it away in an old clock," she said. She tugged at both ends of the ribbon and it came undone. A couple of the papers fell to the floor and I reached down and picked them up. "Old receipts," I said, passing one of them back to Rachel and reading from the other. "For a blue Wilton carpet, 28 litres of white paint, and a dog kennel." She took them from me. "That seems like a lot of paint," she said. "I suppose it depends on what you need to paint," I smiled. Rachel spent the next half an hour thumbing through the top pile of papers. Lots of old receipts, a number of invoices, old gas and electricity bills, old copies of TV licenses. "Mum, this is all pretty standard household stuff. I wouldn't call any of it confidential." "How disappointing," she said, putting the first pile to one side and standing up. "You know, I think Doreen's migraine is starting to rub off on me. I'm going to head to bed. I can look at the rest of this stuff tomorrow. It doesn't look very inspiring anyway," she said, bending over and giving me a quick goodnight peck on the cheek. "All right, love. I won't be far behind you." "Night-night," I said, picking up the empty cups and placing them in the sink. It must have been around 3:30 in the morning when I heard some light tapping on my bedroom door, followed by, "Mum? Mum, are you awake?" It was Rachel. "I am now," I answered. "Are you okay?" "I've had a weird dream again and that light is back," she said. "Light?" I asked sleepily. "The one coming from the old hall. Will you come and look?" she asked. I sighed and drew back the warm bed quilt. It was chilly, so I put on my slippers and dressing gown. Rachel had gone back to her own bedroom. "Look," she said as I entered the room. "It's still there." I approached the window where she was sitting with her nose pressed against the pane and looked out. All I could see was darkness, the outline of the old building and some trees. "Can you see it?" she pleaded. "Not really, Rach," I answered. "Wait till your eyes get used to the dark," she said. "You'll see it then." I pressed my own nose against the window pane and tried to concentrate. Still nothing. I pulled away from the window and turned to Rachel. "Sorry, love. All I see is darkness," I said. She seemed upset. "Then why can I see it? At least I could before." "I don't know. Maybe it's the reflection of a streetlight or a car passing by," I reasoned. "There are no streetlights or cars back there, Mum. That's ridiculous," she said, turning to face me. "Okay, I don't know. Look, love, tell me about the dream," I said, and gently took her hand in mine. "Ooh, you're freezing," I added. She pulled her hand away from me and went to sit on her bed. "I'm not a baby," she scowled. "I know what I saw." "Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just tired and so are you. Tell me about the dream," I asked again. She remained silent for a moment, twisting a loose strand of her hair in her fingers, and then began. "I was on the other side of our garden wall again, but this time it was night. The red gate was open, like it was the last time, and I walked through. There was snow on the ground and I didn't have anything on my feet, but it was weird because I couldn't feel the cold. The beautiful fruit trees were bare and everything looked dead. I carried on walking. I could hear the sound of my feet crunching in the snow as I took each step. Then there was the hoot of an owl in the distance, and I looked up and saw a large stone fountain ahead of me. It had a big carved peacock on the top, and all the water in it was frozen. She stopped and looked at me a little scared. Mum, when I looked down, the reflection in the ice wasn't me. It was Elizabeth Pike. Oh, love, I said, and went to sit next to her on the bed. There's an explanation to all this. The fountain and the painting of Elizabeth Pike, it's all been on your mind after yesterday's visit to the library. That's all. I know, you're probably right. It is spooky that I look so much like her, though, isn't it? She said. Not spooky, just a strange coincidence, that's all, I answered. Don't worry about it. Look, you get back into bed and get some more sleep. You look exhausted. She gave a large yawn and nodded. I went back to my own room, but it took me a long time to get back to sleep. I was starting to regret opening the door to that stranger at Halloween. It was about 6:30 the following morning. I stood in the kitchen with an apron over my dressing gown. I had my sleeves rolled up and I was looking down at a large brown and pink checked bowl full of flour and pieces of butter. I heard Rachel coming down the stairs, and I looked over to witness a very groggy and dishevelled-looking daughter throw herself on the comfy chair near the fire. She drew her knees up onto the chair and hugged them, then looked up at me yawning. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I'm making pastry," I answered. "Why?" she said, yawning widely again and rubbing her eyes. "At this time in the morning?" "Well, I woke up early and I remembered I have to make a Bakewell tart," I said. She rubbed her eyes again in disbelief. "What?" she said. "Why?" I laughed. "I forgot to tell you last night with all the drama about this clock, but I bumped into our neighbour yesterday from number 7 and invited him around for tea and cake." "And you have to make a Bakewell tart?" she said. "Well, yes, it's what he asked for," I answered. "He specifically asked for a Bakewell tart," she said. "He did," I answered again, brushing flour off my fingers. Rachel hauled herself up off the comfy chair and turned towards me. "I'm going up to get a shower. What time is Bakewell tart man coming round?" she asked. I laughed. "Not till this afternoon. He said about 3, I replied. "Anyway, how are you feeling this morning?" I added. "Rough," she said, yawning widely again, and wandered slowly out of the room. Rachel stayed upstairs for the rest of the morning. I noticed that she'd taken with her shopping bag with the stranger's parcel of documents in it, plus Beatrice Scullion's pack of confidential papers and my pen and lined notebook. After I'd had my shower and dressed, I popped my head into her door to see if she wanted a drink. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, her hair piled up in an untidy bun, with the various papers and documents strewn around her. Some of them were in different piles on the floor, and she'd made copious notes and lists in her notebook. She put her pen down and looked up at me. Yes, cup of tea, please," she said, answering my question. "And a bit of toast," she added. "It's nearly lunchtime," I said. "I'm saving myself for the Bakewell tart later," she said, grinning. "OK, tea and toast coming up, madam," I said, making a little mock curtsy. She ignored my playful sarcasm and mouthed a "Thanks, Mum," and then carried on sifting through a pile of papers. I was halfway down the stairs when she suddenly shouted out to me, "Mum, come back, look at this." I walked back into her bedroom. She was holding up a small brass key in one hand and pointing to it with the other. "This was taped to the back of a photograph," she said. "It's from Beatrice Scullion's pile of documents." "A photograph?" I said. "Yeah, there's a few of them, all black and white. and a couple of postcards, all stuffed in the middle of Beatrice's piles of boring receipts and household bills, she answered. Another key, though. That's curious, I said. Any idea what it's for? Well, she said, I think it might be connected with our garden gate key, the key that the stranger left us. I've left that one downstairs on the kitchen table, but I think it had the number 3 on it, didn't it? This little key has the same E and J Pike inscription on it too in tiny writing, but the number is 1. The plot thickens, I said, smiling. Yeah, said Rachel. But look at the photo that the key was attached to, Mum. She handed me an old sepia-coloured photograph. It was of a large detached Victorian building with an indecipherable sign over its grand front door. Look on the back, she instructed. I turned the photograph over and scanned the handwritten inscription. The 5 Keys Hotel, King Street, Monk's Ferry, I said, reading out loud. Mum, Elizabeth Pike was holding a set of 5 brass keys in the painting. Remember? Said Rachel. This is all connected in some way. It must be. We have keys 1 and 3, so there must be more somewhere. Well, I suppose so, I said. But is any of this relevant to Elizabeth Pike's murder, Rachel? We won't know that until we put it all together, Mum, she answered, and picked up a pile of papers, thrusting them towards me. It must all link together, Mum. It must. Part 6. Bakewell Tart. It was about 3:10 in the afternoon, and Rachel and I were waiting in the kitchen for the arrival of our next-door neighbour. She sat at the table with her stack of documents and papers next to her, and I was on my knees poking about at the back of one of the kitchen cupboards, trying to retrieve my poshest plates, which I'd annoyingly put at the back of the cupboard on the first day we'd moved in. Rachel was bored and tapped her pen rhythmically against her half-empty mug of tea. Rachel, will you stop doing that? It's annoying, I said. He's late, she said, dropping her pen on the table and flipping open her mobile phone to check the time. Only by about 10 minutes, I began, as the front doorbell suddenly rang. We both looked at each other. It was clear that Rachel wasn't going to get up and answer the door. He's your guest, she said, smiling coyly, and took a sip of her tea. I stood up, wiped off the dust from my jeans, and gave Rachel a scowl. Hello, I said to the gentleman on the front doorstep. I'm really glad you could make it. Please come in. I showed him through to the kitchen, where Rachel was setting out the newly retrieved posh plates. This is my daughter Rachel, I said. Rachel smiled, waved a little high, and continued to set the table. His mouth dropped, and he stared at Rachel in wonder. Are you okay? I asked him. He turned towards me. Yes, sorry. Oh, you have Bakewell Tart, he suddenly said, pointing at the centre of the table where my freshly baked tart sat. It's my favourite. How did you know? Oh, I said, confused. Actually, you asked if I had any yesterday when we met and I invited you around. Did I? He said. I'll have to take your word for it. But if I did say it, and I obviously did, otherwise how would you know, then thank you. It looks delicious. Rachel looked at me and rolled her eyes. I glared at her to stop. I suppose I should introduce myself, he said, looking around at our large kitchen and seating himself at the table. Then he stopped, sighed and added, You know, I haven't been in this kitchen since Miss Scullion was taken into the care home. Must have been 2 and something years ago now. It hasn't changed much. Well, we've only just moved in, as you know. Still unpacking, in fact, I began before Rachel interrupted me. You knew Beatrice Scullion? She asked. Yes, I did, young lady, he answered awkwardly. noticeably avoiding her gaze. For many, many years, I knew her as Bee, though, a lovely lady, lived here all her life, you know. Oh, wow, said Rachel excitedly. Then I have so much to ask you. I'm doing research into the house and the old manor at the back and all the people connected to it and... Rach, I cut in sharply, maybe we should have some tea and proper introductions first before all the questions. The old man smiled. Yes, yes, tea and tart first, questions later. Oh, and you can call me Bert. The full name is Herbert Fogg, but only my mother called me Herbert. Rachel looked over at me grinning. Another Fogg, she mouthed exaggeratedly, and I put my fingers to my lips to direct her to hush. Bert was on his second helping of Bakewell tart, and was telling us all about his vast collection of stamps and old coins. He'd asked me if his tart could be warmed, and whether we had any ice cream. We didn't, so he ate both slices without the benefit of a sweet topping, and seemed to enjoy them nonetheless. He wiped the crumbs from around his mouth with a piece of kitchen roll handed to him by Rachel, patted his full stomach, and took a sip of tea. My brother told me he bumped into you the other day, he began. Said you were wandering round the graveyard. Oh, yes, we were, I answered. Your brother is Stanley, then? Stanley Fogg? Younger brother, yes, said Bert. Lives at Catlow Cottages. I pop in now and then, especially after Doris died. Doris? That was his wife's name, I asked. He was putting flowers on her grave. At that, Rachel cut in. We weren't actually wandering around. We were looking for something in particular. A grave. I know, said Bert, still avoiding Rachel's gaze. Stan said you were looking at the Pike grave. Yes, I said. We discovered that the Pike family, or should I say the two brothers, built this house, and your house, of course, before it was split. Bert nodded. Aye, he said, that they did. It was called Hallows House back then. It was Bee's uncle, Sylvester Scullion, who split it up. Did you know that? Yes, we did, I answered. It was in the 1920s, wasn't it? At least that was what your brother Stanley said. He also said it was sold after the brothers died, but we found out that... No, Bert cut in. It wasn't sold. Stan always gets things wrong. Bee's uncle Sylvester was left it. He was the house manager at the old hall. He was left it by Joseph Pike, who died last. And Bee was born here. Did I tell you that? No, I answered. That is interesting. We didn't know that either, did we, Rachel? I looked over at Rachel, who had opened up her notebook and was balancing it on her knee. She nodded her head in agreement and turned towards Bert. So, Mr. Fogg, when was Beatrice, born? Did her parents live here too? Was she born in our side of the house or your side of the house? Oh, and do you have a wine cellar and a fountain in your back garden? She asked. So many questions, said Bert, raising his arms and flapping them around. And so many papers, he continued, looking over at Rachel's pile of documents. Yes, she said, tapping them with her pen. We found some of them in the old clock in the hallway last night. They used to belong to Bee. But we have other documents too, I said. Mr. Fogg, something very strange happened the other evening. A man, a stranger, knocked on our door and handed us an envelope with old newspaper clippings inside and other things. He said they were from the Messrs. Pike, said Rachel, passing the large envelope to Bert. He looked startled and slowly took the package from Rachel before putting it down on the table without looking at it. A stranger, you say? He said, looking at me. What did he look like? Oh, I answered, a little surprised by the question. Well, he was tall, thin. It was difficult to see his features in the dark, but I think he wore round-rimmed glasses and he had a moustache. He also had a faint accent. I couldn't work it out at the time, but now I think about it, he could have been Irish, I added. And he was wearing a top hat, Rachel cut in, and weird old-fashioned clothes. We thought maybe he was dressed up for trick-or-treat. He's the whole reason why we've been trying to find out about the Pike family and... Before she could finish her sentence, Bert said, "Then it was all Hallows Eve." Yes, Rachel answered. "Is that relevant?" Bert didn't answer. Instead, he looked down, sighed, and shook his head. "Mr. Fogg?" I asked. "Is there something we should know?" You look concerned. He still didn't answer. Instead, he looked at Rachel's stack of papers and, addressing her for the first time, said, "Are there any old photos in that pile of B's documents, young lady?" Yes, she said, handing a selection to him. "There are pictures of some old buildings and people, but I don't know who they are." Bert slowly searched through the photographs, stopping at an old sepia-coloured image of a family group. He took out a pair of reading glasses from his pocket and looked carefully at the photo. Then he placed it on the table and turned it to face us. "Now then," he said, pointing to a small family group. "This is B's mother and father, Alice and Charlie. That's Bee herself as a child, sitting on her mother's knee. And at the side of Bee's father is his brother, Sylvester, Bee's uncle." We both peered at the formal family photograph, taken out in the open air, in front of a garden wall adorned with climbing roses. To the left of the group, and within the stone wall, was a red wooden gate. Bee's father held a basket full of apples, and Bee herself held a small apple in her tiny hand. "Is that our garden gate?" exclaimed Rachel, looking at me. I shrugged my shoulders and shook my head. I don't know, I suppose it could be, I said. "It is," said Bert bluntly. "The photograph was taken in your back garden." Rachel looked at me, open-mouthed. "Charlie and Alice lived in your house, number 9, and Sylvester lived in my house, number 7, continued Bert. "The Scullions were an Irish family. Charlie was the younger brother, and he came over from Dublin with his pregnant wife and moved in. That was the arrangement for years and years, until Sylvester died in 1941, the year I was born, I might add, and the year my parents moved in. They'd been bombed out, you know, during the Blitz." Rachel took up her pen and began to write furiously in her notebook. "Anyway," he said, pointing to the tall, thin, bespectacled figure of Sylvester Scullion in the photograph, "do you notice any resemblance to your stranger?" "What do you mean?" I asked, confused. Rachel looked at me startled, and then at Bert. "No, it can't be the same person. That's impossible," she said. "Bert, you can't be suggesting that the stranger who came to our door the other night was Bee's uncle, Sylvester Scullion," I said, picking up the photo and looking more closely at the figure. "He must have been dead for 70 years? 77, to be precise," answered Bert bluntly. "Then that's ridiculous," I said. "The man I shook hands with the other night was very much alive." Bert remained silent. Then, sighing, he picked up the last crumbs of Bakewell tart from his plate with his fingertips and placed them in his mouth. Rachel frowned at me and took the photograph and intently examined the figure of Sylvester Scullion. The wind suddenly picked up outside, and I realised how dark it had become. Bert broke his silence and whispered, "Strange things happen sometimes." Strange things. Rachel put the photograph down on the table. What things? She said. Do you believe in ghosts? He said, looking directly at her for the first time. No, she said stubbornly. Then I've probably said too much, said Bert, rising from his chair. Thank you for the Bakewell tart, Mrs. It was very kind of you to make it, and very nice to meet you both, but I should probably be going. You can't leave it there, said Rachel suddenly, also rising from her chair. Mr. Fogg, Bert, you need to tell us more. Are you saying that Sylvester Scullion or his ghost came to our door on Hallows Eve? Rachel, don't be ridiculous, I said. But strange things have been happening to us, haven't they, Mum? Said Rachel. Bert, why did you ask us if it was the night of All Hallows Eve when the stranger came to our door? What's the connection? Is it because that's the night that Elizabeth Pike was murdered? Bert suddenly stopped at the kitchen door. Then he turned slowly to face us. Yes, he said gravely. Please stay, pleaded Rachel. I've been having awful nightmares. I need to know more. At that, Bert sat slowly back down in his chair again and looking over at the kettle, whispered, All right, young lady, if your mother will allow it. But perhaps another cup of tea first. Part 7. Ghosts. The light of the kitchen fire created dancing shadows on the ceiling, and the wind continued to pick up outside. Stray branches from one of the apple trees tapped eerily against the window pane, like somebody knocking to come in. Rachel brought over 3 steaming mugs of tea and put them down on the table. Bert picked his up and took a sip. Where to start, he said, staring into the fire and sighing. We both looked expectantly at him, but remained quiet. Then I'll begin by telling you what Bea told me many years ago, he began, about her uncle Sylvester and the terrible murder of Elizabeth Pike. Rachel pulled her chair closer to the table and took up her notepad and pen. So as I said, he continued, the Scullions came from Dublin. Sylvester came over to Monk's Ferry when he was a young man. He gained employment with the Pikes because of the Irish connection. Of course, Alpheus Pike was from Dublin too, Rachel interrupted, scanning a page of her notes with her finger. Bert nodded. Yes, that's right. But it was more than that. The families knew each other well from old, back in Ireland. Sylvester was a few years younger than Elizabeth Pike, but the way Bea put it, they were very close. Some might say too close. Too close, I asked. You mean like a romantic relationship? They were lovers? Bert took another sip of his tea and continued. I don't think it ever got that far. I'm not sure it could. You see, the Pikes did well for themselves after they came to Monk's Ferry, became wealthy, whereas the Scullions remained quite poor back in Dublin. It wouldn't have done for Sylvester and Elizabeth to have been together, as it were. That's so sad, said Rachel. Yes, I suppose so, said Bert. Anyway, a couple of years after arriving at the old hall, the Pikes made Sylvester the house manager. He was put in charge of the comings and goings in the house, the day-to-day running, I suppose. Bea told me he was very young still, but very good at his job. The brothers trusted him, and they trusted him with the care of their sister while they were going away on business. Rachel and I glanced at each other. I think I know what's coming, she said ominously. I nodded in agreement. I'm presuming that the brothers were away on the night that she was murdered, I asked. Yes, replied Bert. They were back in Ireland on family business or something. That's how Bea put it. He stopped and stared into the fire, They never saw her alive again, he finished gloomily. Awful, said Rachel, sighing. Do you know what happened on that night? I asked. Not really, answered Bert. It was all clouded in mystery. All I know, from B, is that her Uncle Sylvester never forgave himself. He was called away that afternoon. It was All Hallows Eve, as you know, and he didn't return until the following morning. Of course, it was all over by then. She was dead. But if he was called away, there wasn't anything he could have done about it, I said. Well, the way B put it, he thought that if he'd been in the house that night, none of it would have happened, said Bert. Nobody, the police included, ever discovered who the murderer was. Or what the motive was, Rachel cut in. Yes, said Bert. Although B said that her uncle had his suspicions. Really? Said Rachel. Who did he suspect? She picked up one of her newspaper clippings and handed it to Bert. This report from the Time says that Elizabeth had visitors that evening of the murder, but they were never identified. Bert took it and briefly scanned the faded print. I don't know anything about that, he said. All I know is that her murder changed everything at the big house, the old hall. The brothers, Ebenezer and Joseph, were devastated. It broke most people's hearts, mind. She was well loved in the town and was set to marry the local vicar the following year, in the springtime, I believe. Instead, they buried her in the churchyard back yonder on a miserable, stormy November day. My great-great-grandfather was at the funeral. Yes, Stanley told me, I cut in. That was Albert Fogg, wasn't it? He lived at the old hall as a boy with his mother. She was the housekeeper who found Elizabeth Pike's body. That he did, and that she did, answered Bert. But your brother said it was your great-grandfather, said Rachel, looking at her notes. I told you, our Stan gets everything wrong, said Bert, and took the last few sips of his tea. The light outside had all but disappeared, and I got up to draw the curtains. There's more tea in the pot if anyone wants another cup, I offered, and reached over to turn on a lamp. Don't mind if I do, said Bert, offering me his empty mug. No thanks, Mum, said Rachel, shaking her head. I'm so full of tea I could burst. She looked across at Bert. But Bert, I still don't understand why you think Sylvester Scullion turned up at our door the other night, beyond the grave, 70-odd years after he died, and handed Mum and I a package of papers. Bert handed me his empty cup, and I filled it from the still warm teapot. Well, he answered, as I said, Elizabeth's brothers were inconsolable. Sylvester was heartbroken and left full of guilt. After the funeral, the brothers packed up and moved out of the old hall, almost immediately, and lived for a short time at the local inn, while the new house, this house, Hallows House, was being built. I think the inn was on King Street. It's not there anymore. Anyhow, they left Sylvester in charge of the old hall, and he lived there pretty much by himself as a sort of caretaker for many years. But his heart wasn't in it, and neither was theirs, and the old house slowly began to crumble away. After the brothers died and he was left Hallows House, the old hall was abandoned. Nobody wanted to buy it or live in it. It's been empty ever since. Bert took another sip of his tea and continued. I don't think the brothers blamed him for her death or anything. After all, as I said, he wasn't there when it happened. But rumour has it that they all made a vow that they would not rest until her murder had been solved. And that vow still stood after their deaths, I said, which is why you think a phantom came to our door and gave us those papers so that we could uncover the murder of Elizabeth Pike? Bert nodded slowly. But Mr. Fogg, I said, stiffening my pose, You asked my daughter before if she believed in ghosts. Well, I have to tell you that I don't either. I also don't understand why we, Rachel and I, would be involved in all of this. It seems preposterous. Just because we live in this house now, it doesn't make sense. Bert sighed. I know, he said, and then turned from me to look at Rachel. I don't understand your connection either, and I understand your doubts. But have you noticed how much your daughter is the image of Elizabeth Pike? Rachel's notebook suddenly slipped off her knee and onto the floor, and her eyes widened. She trembled slightly and looked over at me, and then at Bert. You noticed, she exclaimed. As soon as I entered the room, young lady, said Bert. It's quite astonishing. But what does it mean? Said Rachel pleadingly. Mum said it was a coincidence. This is no coincidence, said Bert bluntly. You obviously have some kind of connection to the Pike family. We don't, I cut in irritably. Mr. Fogg, it's getting late, and I think it's about time for you to leave. Bert stood up a little wounded by my harshness. Yes, of course, he said. It wasn't my intention to upset you, either of you. I'm not upset, Bert, said Rachel. It's my fault. I asked you to stay. Mum doesn't mean to be so rude. She looked over at me crossly. I'll see Mr. Fogg out. When Rachel came back into the kitchen, I was still sitting at the table. I'd picked up her notebook and was flicking through some of the pages. I heard you chatting to Mr. Fogg at the front door, Rachel, I said, looking up. She ignored me at first and picked up the remains of the Bakewell tart. I said I'd take the rest of this over to him tomorrow morning before I go to work, and I apologised to him for your outburst, she said. Rachel, I began, I know you're upset with me, but this is all getting ridiculous. You're losing sleep, having bad dreams. I'm going to my room, she snapped, opening the fridge and placing the tart inside. Then she picked up the teacups and placed them in the sink with a deliberate clatter. Rachel, I said again, trying to get her attention. She ignored me and stomped into the hallway. Oh, and he also has a fountain in his garden with a peacock on the top. She snapped at me from the hallway. I got up from my chair and joined her in the hallway. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs. She turned to look at me. Tell me, Mum, how did I know that? How did I dream last night that there was a peacock on top of the fountain? I don't know, Rachel. Was it something you read at the library? I don't have any answers, I sighed. There are things going on here that neither of us understand, Mum, but I need to understand, and I need you to support me. I carefully placed a hand on her shoulder. With the palm of my other hand, I gently stroked her hair. I know, Rach, I'm just getting a little scared. She looked at me and sighed. Me too, Mum. Part 8. Books and Bonfire Toffee. I woke the following morning to find the sun streaming through a gap in my bedroom curtains. I turned over groggily and checked my alarm clock. It was 9:20. I groaned. The alarm hadn't gone off. Sleepily, I put on my dressing gown and crossed the landing to Rachel's room. Her curtains were open, and her bed had been neatly made. I hoped that she'd had a good night's sleep, with none of those disturbing dreams. But I was still troubled about the conversation we'd had with next-door neighbour Bert the evening before. I didn't believe in ghosts or the supernatural. How could a man who had been dead for 70-odd years turn up at our doorstep? It beggared belief. But I was also perplexed because I couldn't fathom why Rachel looked so much like Elizabeth Pike. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence, But was Birch right? Could we be related to the Pike family? It seemed too ridiculous an idea to even contemplate, but I decided I'd give my great-aunt Frances a ring anyway for reassurance. I knew that she had an original copy of our family tree and was a mine of information about old family business. Having said that, I couldn't be sure of Rachel's father's side of the family. I hadn't seen Tom for a number of years, and I was sure Rachel had mentioned that he was currently living in some far-flung place. I'd have to ask her to contact him, but first I'd speak to Frances. I wandered down the stairs and into the kitchen. There was a handwritten note on the table. It read, "Gone to work. Didn't want to wake you. Are we going to fireworks? Text me. See you later. Love, R. Kiss." Fireworks, I wondered, and then noticed a colourful flyer lying underneath Rachel's note. I picked it up and read it. Monk's Ferry Priory. Firework display and bonfire. Monday the 5th of November, 2018, 6:30 p.m. Hot dogs and toffee apples. Tickets £5 from Chaplin's Books, Priory Lane. All welcome. Ah, gunpowder, treason and plot, I smiled. Of course. It was bonfire night. I put the leaflet back down on the table and picked up my phone to text Rachel. It seemed like a good idea that we go and have some fun together after the strain of the recent move and the tension of the past couple of days. She sent me a message straight back which said, "Great, can you get tickets?" I text back that I would and asked if she would like me to pick anything up for her from town. "Bonfire, Toffee," came back the immediate and emphatic response. After a quick shower and a hasty breakfast, I headed out to pick up the tickets from Chaplin's Books. I hadn't been to the shop before, but I guessed it wouldn't be far from the old priory, since they both appeared to be in the same vicinity. It was bright and sunny and the sky was clear, but as I walked down Dig Street and headed towards the riverfront, an icy wind brushed against my cheeks, forcing me to pause and adjust the woolly scarf around my neck. As I was retying it, I realised I was standing outside another of the town's local inns. "The old house at home," I muttered to myself, reading the words on the old hanging sign above my head. Unusually, the word house had been spelled with a W in place of the normal U. I wasn't sure what that was all about. I took a close look at the sign, which was swinging and creaking in the chilly breeze, and noticed that the faded and chipped picture on the sign was an illustration of the old manor house. It looked just like the old hall at the back of our house, but a much grander and less dilapidated version. Over the pub's entrance door, in tiny writing, read, "Proprietor, Fuchsia Grange de Alderville, licensed to sell alcohol." What a mouthful, I thought, and then realised I'd heard the name de Alderville before. Of course, the de Aldervilles had been the original owners of the old hall, and one of them, Radford, had sold it on to Alpheus Pike. Fuchsia Grange de Alderville was likely a descendant of the family. It was interesting that the old family connection still existed in Monk's Ferry. I made a mental note to mention it to Rachel. I carried on down Dig Lane and then turned left onto Priory Lane, crossed over the road and headed over to the riverfront, where I leant against the railings to take in the spectacular view. The wide river sparkled in the sunlight, and I could see some small boats bobbing up and down in the water, and an old lighthouse perched on a rocky outcrop to the right. Beyond that, the ancient Welsh hills made an imposing backdrop, with their snowy peaks shining brilliantly in the winter sunshine. Near the horizon, the river darkened where it merged with the Irish Sea, and I could see little flecks of white foam rise and fall with the sway of the waves. I thought about the Pikes and the Scullions, and supposed that they had come ashore here at the old ferry terminal further down the lane, on their journey from Dublin, all those years ago. Suddenly my reverie was broken when I heard a shout coming in my direction from the other side of the road. I turned. It was Stanley Fogg with his little dog. He was waving furiously at me. "Hello," he shouted. "I thought it was you." "Oh, hello," I shouted back, surprised. "Taking in the air?" he asked, as he picked up his tiny dog and walked across the road towards me. "Ah, yes," I said. "I'm surprised you recognised me. I've come out to get tickets for the fireworks display tonight. I couldn't help having a look at the view." "It's a grand one," he said, adding, "You'll need Chaplin's books for the tickets." He pointed down the lane, and I nodded. "Yes, I've seen the flyer," I said. "I'm also looking for somewhere to buy Bonfire toffee. My daughter has a craving." "Well, you'll need the ferry newsagent," said Stanley. "A few doors away from the bookshop. They should have some there. They sell a lot of those old-fashioned sweeties, sugared bonbons and the like." "Oh, good. I'll pop in there too," I said. "I'll walk down with you," he said, placing his little dog back down on the pavement. "I might buy myself some pear drops." We headed slowly down the lane together, towards the newsagent's. Stanley began telling me about all the various Monk's Ferry firework displays he'd been to over the years. "Are you going to this one tonight?" I asked. "Yes, I think so," he answered, "if it's not too cold. I think our Bert's already got tickets. He popped in to see me this morning." "Oh, I see," I said uneasily. I wondered whether Bert had told Stanley about yesterday's visit to me, his rude neighbour next door. It didn't take long for me to get an answer. "Our Bert said you make a wonderful Bakewell tart," he said. "In fact, he brought some of it round to me. Said your daughter dropped it off." "Oh, yes, Rachel said she would," I answered slowly. Stanley picked up on my anxious tone. "You know, you mustn't take too much heed of what our Bert says," he said, stopping suddenly and turning to face me. "He's liable to flights of fancy sometimes." "I'm not sure what you mean," I answered cautiously. "Ghosts," said Stanley bluntly. I was taken aback by his unexpected directness, although it seemed to be a family trait, and looked away for a few seconds. Stanley put a hand gently on my arm. "Let me buy you a cup of tea, dear," he said. "You look like you need warming up. There's a little cafe just next to the newsagent's." "OK, yes, that would be nice," I said, thanking him. The riverside cafe was tiny, but warm and inviting. We sat down at a little round table with a red and white checkered tablecloth. Stanley ordered 2 teas and a fruit scone for himself. I declined his offer of something to eat, since I'd only recently had breakfast. I watched him butter his scone and offer some of it to his little dog, which stood patiently next to his chair leg, while I took a sip of my tea, cupping my hands around the mug to warm them. He took a bite of his scone and looked up at me. "You see, our Bert joined the Navy as a lad. 16, I think he was. Got out of the house as soon as he could." "Out of the house?" I asked, puzzled. "Mother and father's house, next door to you," he said. "Bert moved back in after our parents died. Not sure why, really, since he spent much of his youth trying to get away from the place." "Why was he trying to get away?" I asked. "He's what you might call a little sensitive," said Stanley, taking another bite of his buttered scone. I watched little bits of it fall back onto his plate, and he picked them up with a moist finger and popped them into his mouth. "Sensitive?" I asked, perplexed. "Well," said Stanley, "to be blunt, He always insisted that our house was haunted, right from being a little boy. It drove our mother crazy because the rest of us didn't know what he was talking about. So you didn't experience anything yourself, I said, slowly taking another sip of tea. Well, I wouldn't say that exactly. I did hear some things, creaks, bumps in the night, that sort of thing. But I never told Mother and Father, of course, and it sounds awful to say now, but if our Bert was getting into trouble over it, then I was happy to stay out of it. And what does he think about that all these years later? He doesn't know, said Stanley forcefully. Some things are best left unsaid. I remained silent, since I wasn't sure how to respond to Stanley's candid admission. Anyway, he said, our Bert reckoned he saw ghosts. Well, one ghost in particular, in the back garden. It was always the same young woman, dressed in blue. He'd be woken by the sound of her crying and looking out of his bedroom window. He'd see her wandering around our garden or sitting at the fountain. Sometimes he said he'd see a light on in one of the windows of the old manor house at the back. He said it was the same woman in the same blue dress, staring back at him out of the window. I sighed and thought about the things that Rachel had been telling me, about her strange dreams and the light she'd seen coming from the old hall, from her own bedroom window. Did he say who he thought the ghost was? I asked Stanley apprehensively. Oh yes, answered Stanley. He was always sure about that. It was the ghost of Elizabeth Pike, you see. Stuck forever between two worlds. I think that's how he put it. I don't understand. What did he mean by that? I asked uneasily. Stuck in limbo, is what I think he meant. You know, between life and death. But between you and me, it was Mrs. Scullion next door who put all those ideas in his head. You mean Beatrice Scullion, I said. I think Bert said he called her B. Yes, B. She was a bit eccentric, shall we say. He was always around there as a child, listening to her stories. She loved to tell stories. So she told him all about the story of Elizabeth Pike's murder then, I asked. Oh yes, he answered, though not the kind of thing you tell a young boy with a vivid imagination. I nodded in agreement. So you don't believe in the ghost of Elizabeth Pike, I asked. Our Bert believes it, said Stanley, putting another piece of scone in his mouth and avoiding a direct answer to my question. He believes that the ghost of Elizabeth Pike will continue to walk the earth until her murder is solved. I nodded, sighed and rubbed the left side of my temple, which was starting to ache. Actually, he's not the only one to have seen the Blue Lady, as he calls her, he said after a pause. Oh, I said, surprised. Who else has seen her? Mrs. Grange, up the road there. She's the landlady of the old house. Ah, the pub, I said. I passed it just before. Yes, she went to school with our Bert. Was in the same year, I think. She used to live in the vicarage, opposite the church. I think her father was Reverend something or other. I think the name over the pub door said de Alderville, I said. Could it have been that? It's the same name as the people who originally lived at the old hall. Yes, maybe. Anyways, you can ask her yourself, said Stanley, picking up his little dog and rising from his chair. The old house opens for lunchtime trade about 12. I glanced at my phone. It was just past 11. Where had the morning gone? I'll do that, I said, taking the last sips of my tea and rising from my own chair. I followed Stanley out of the cafe and into the newsagent's next door. Arranged across 3 long shelves at the back of the shop counter were a number of large glass containers filled with brightly coloured sweets and toffees. The shop assistant measured out 4 ounces of pear drops and 4 ounces of Bonfire toffee on one of those old-fashioned sets of scales with separate weights, and placed the little piles in 2 small paper bags. Stanley paid for the sweeties and a local newspaper and handed me the bag of toffee. "A little present from me to your daughter," he said, smiling. "Thank you, that's very kind," I said. "I'll let her know." Outside the shop, Stanley said his goodbyes, and I said I hoped we might see him and Bert later at the fireworks display. After that I wandered a little further down the road until I came to Chaplin's Books. The tall and narrow shop frontage had just one window and a door on the ground floor. A chime from a bell announced my arrival as I unfastened the latch on the faded blue shop door and went in. The room was small and cluttered with books, with floor-to-ceiling shelving on every wall. Every shelf was crammed with old volumes, and there were piles of books of different sizes randomly stacked on the floor in front of the lower shelves. Other haphazardly assembled book towers were perched on a number of wooden dining chairs, and the shop had that wonderful old musty book smell that you either adore or despise, depending on your appreciation of old books, I suppose. I couldn't see anybody about, so I headed to a battered office desk at the back of the shop. Unsurprisingly, there were also small piles of books stacked on the desk, so I got a bit of a shock when I peered over the piles and saw a small face with big eyes staring up at me. "Me gran's popped out," said the diminutive head before I had a chance to say anything, "but she'll be back again soon. Can I help you?" I smiled at the young boy on the other side of the desk, who I reckoned must have been about 10 or 11 years of age. He smiled back. "Hello," I said. "Do you have tickets for the fireworks display at the Priory tonight?" "Yes, there's some left," he answered, pulling open a drawer in the desk and taking out a small pile of hand-printed tickets wrapped in an elastic band. "How many do you want?" "Just 2, thanks," I said, reaching into my purse to take out some change. Just as I was about to hand the young boy a £10 note, the front door suddenly opened with a loud jingle and a rush of cold air, and a large older lady wearing a heavy dark woolen coat with a huge fur collar bustled in. "It's all right, Robert, I'll sort it," she said to the young boy, and turning to me said, "You wanting Bonfire tickets, love?" "I am, but your grandson has been very helpful and he's—" I began, before the large lady cut across me. "Robert, what did I say?" She snapped at the young boy. "Go upstairs and put the telly on or something. Oh, and put the kettle on first, I'm parched." The young boy hopped off his chair and handed me the 2 tickets before disappearing behind a tall pile of books into what I presumed was a hidden doorway to upstairs. "He's off school again, you know," said the large lady, turning to me and taking off her huge coat. "Our Veronica says he's got a cold, but there's nought wrong with the lad. Any opportunity to be at the shop." "Oh, right," I said, handing her the £10 note. "He likes books, then." She took the note from me, screwed it up and stuffed it into one of her coat pockets. "Yes, not that it'll do him any good if he doesn't get a good education," she hissed. Before I had a chance to say anything, she continued, "You see, he's with me all day. I'm normally at home. This is my Arthur's shop, but he's in bed with one of his heads, so I'm here. And Veronica, my daughter, she's a nurse, has left him, the lad, with me," she continued, without hardly drawing a breath. "And between you and me," she said, looking around the room first to see if anyone else was listening, "I could do without it today. I had to cancel a hair appointment and I was meeting Mrs. Fogg for lunch at the cafe. I had to nip out to let her know. Had to leave the lad in charge." "Oh dear, that's not good," I said awkwardly, adding, "He did very well, though, your grandson." She sighed and casually threw her coat over one of the wooden chairs. Some of the books, precariously piled on top of the chair, toppled to the floor with a thud. But if she noticed, she didn't seem to care. "Anyway, dear," she continued, manoeuvring her large hips adeptly behind the desk and squashing herself down on the now vacant chair, "can I help you with anything else?" I said, looking around at the vast array of old books, which didn't look as though they were in any particular order. "Actually, do you have a local history section?" She turned her head and screamed towards the upstairs opening. "Robert, do we have anything on local history?" And then to me, in a much quieter voice, "If we do, our Robert'll know. I told you, he's never out of the place." Suddenly, Robert's head appeared from behind the opening. He had a mug of hot steaming tea in his hand, which he handed to his gran. Then, looking at me, he said in a very grown-up manner, "Were you looking for anything in particular, madam?" "Oh, well, yes," I answered, taken aback by his unexpected maturity. "Do you have anything on the history of the old hall? You know, the manor house next to All Hallows Church on Monk's Ferry Lane, or the church itself, something like that?" Robert nodded at me enthusiastically and skipped over to the other side of the room, dodging a couple of piles of books as he went. He opened up a step-ladder that was leaning against one of the shelves and scrambled up to the top so that he could reach the highest shelf. "We have general histories of the town here," he said from the top of the ladder, pointing to a row of different-sized hardbacks, some with dust covers and some without. "You might find something in there." He took one of the smaller books and flicked through some of the pages before launching it at me. "Catch," he said loudly. Startled, I tried to grab at the book as it came hurtling towards me, missed, and watched it sail past me and land with a thud on top of the desk, nearly taking out his gran's mug of tea. "Robert," she screeched, "you nearly sent my tea flying, you daft apeth." "Sorry, Gran," he said sheepishly. He mouthed a sorry at me, and then, with some difficulty, placed a couple of other bigger, heavier books under his arm and slowly climbed down the ladder. At the bottom, he handed them over to me, and I inspected the covers. Monk's Ferry, From the Romans to the Victorians, by Maria Catchpole, Ph.D., I read, looking at the first one. "Published in 1973, said Robert. "So it is," I said, inspecting the information page on the inside of the book. "He remembers all the dates, all of them," said his gran, taking a noisy slurp of her tea. Robert looked pleased at his gran's suggestion, too young to pick up on her sarcasm. "I really do," he said to me, beaming. "Wow, that's some skill," I said, smiling. "Okay, let's have a look at this other book." I couldn't see an obvious place to sit down with the book, so I passed Maria Catchpole's history to Robert and perched the large leather-bound volume on top of one of the book piles. I ran the palm of my hand carefully over the elaborately decorated cover. "Ah," I said in recognition and delight, "The History of the Old Hall by the Reverend Charles Griffin." "Do you know it?" asked Robert. "It's from a series of 10 volumes, but we only have 2 of them. Don't we, Gran?" said Robert. "If you say so, our Robert," answered Gran, sipping more of her tea. "I do know it," I said. "My daughter and I were only looking at a copy in the town's library archives the other day. What a wonderful book, and what a wonderful find, Robert." Robert's smile widened and, clearly pleased with himself, added, "This one's from 1901. It's a first edition, and it has a dedication inside." "So it has," I said, opening the large cover. There, on the first page, was the dedication, handwritten in pencil. I read it aloud. "To my dearest brother Cecil, Culpham, poena premit commes veritatem dies apparit. Charles, March 1901. Do you know what any of that means? Said Gran, rising from her chair and craning her neck to get a better look. No, I don't, I answered, perplexed. But I'll find out. Part 9. The Old House at Home. Looks expensive, said Gran, as one by one she watched me turn over some of the large pages of the book. She put down her tea and squeezed her way around the desk to get a closer look. We'll throw this one in free if you want, she continued, taking Maria Catchpole's book from Robert and thrusting it towards me. Oh, I said, but I don't know how much you want for it. Well, as I say, it's going to be expensive. A big old book like that, isn't it, Robert? She said, looking at Robert to agree. It's £65. The price is written in pencil on the inside front cover, he said, helpfully. And we'll throw this in too, said Gran, waggling a paperback that she'd found on top of a book pile next to her. I took it from her. Pencil Sharpeners of the World, I read. Not sure that's something I'm interested in, but thank you anyway. You can't please some people, said Gran, casually tossing the paperback aside and walking to the hidden doorway behind the desk. Robert, I'm going upstairs for a lie down before lunch. Let me know when the lady has made a decision. Robert nodded and Gran disappeared. We both looked at each other awkwardly. Well, I'd really like the book, Robert, with or without Pencil Sharpeners of the World, I smiled. He put his hand over his mouth and giggled. Do you take credit cards? I asked. He shook his head and pointed to a large hand-written sign behind the desk, which shouted, Cash only. Thank you. I've no idea how I missed that, I said, smiling at him again. I wandered back down the road, past the newsagents and the Riverside Cafe, adjusting my scarf as I went to ward off the sharp northerly breeze coming from the direction of the river. I'd decided to pick up the book tomorrow and had asked Robert if he could put it away for me till then. I'd taken a snapshot of the dedication page using my phone so that I could look up the Latin inscription later on. It was now 11:45, and I'd decided to pop into the Old House at Home pub on my way home to see if the landlady, Fuchsia Grange d'Aldeville, was around for a quick chat. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to approach a complete stranger on the subject of ghosts, but perhaps she could tell me more about the old hall and the d'Aldeville connection, if nothing else. The main door to the pub was now open, and I could smell the aroma of fried food wafting from the kitchens as I entered. It took a minute or so before my eyes began to get accustomed to the dark interior after the bright sunlight outside. I walked over to the oak-panelled bar with its large cream beer pump handles and brass drip trays. The bar towels advertised the Happy Monk and Ferryman craft beers, and there was the distinct smell of stale beer coming from the sticky carpet under my feet, which had probably experienced many a spill over the years. "We're not open yet, love," came a man's voice from somewhere behind the bar. I looked round, and a stout, middle-aged man wearing a stained white apron with an equally stained white tea towel slung over his shoulder came out of the back. "Oh, sorry, the door was open," I said. "It's all right. We're just setting up for lunch. If you'd like to take a seat, I'll be over with the menu in a minute," he said. "Actually, I'm not here for lunch. I'm wondering if the landlady is about. Mrs. Grange?" "Fee's out back. Who shall I say wants her?" he asked. "My name is," I was just about to say, when a loud crashing sound came from what I presumed was the direction of the kitchen, followed by a yell of rage and a stream of profanity. A tall, older woman with bright scarlet dyed hair tied up in a large untidy bun came furiously rushing out to the bar area. She wore an emerald green pashmina scarf over a dress the same shade as her hair, and long beaded earrings which swung from side to side as she spoke. "That bloody cat!" she yelled at the man in the scruffy apron. "Ford, what the hell is Winston doing in the kitchen?" Ford winced and nodded in my direction. The woman shot me a glance and immediately lowered her voice. "I'm dreadfully sorry. I suppose you must have heard all that," she said, smiling awkwardly at me while twirling one of her long earrings with the fingers of her right hand. I opened my mouth, unsure whether to be polite and lie, or be honest and admit I'd heard every single word. Before I'd had chance to answer, however, a large ginger cat came racing out of the kitchen area with something meaty looking in its mouth, followed by a teenage girl in an apron, and bolted for the front door. "Oh, I give up," shouted the woman in scarlet, throwing her arms into the air. "Seriously, Ford, if the health inspector were here—" She suddenly stopped and turned to look at me in horror. "You're not the—" she started. I laughed, realising where she was going with her train of thought. No, I'm not from environmental health," I said, but at the same time making a mental note not to have lunch at the old house at home. The teenage girl came back from chasing the cat and stood breathlessly next to Ford. "He's run up the street. I'm not chasing after him. I don't get paid enough," she said, wiping sweat off her forehead with her hands and wiping her palms on her equally grimy apron. "Just carry on peeling those potatoes," said Ford to the girl, and then looking at the woman in scarlet said, "This lady is looking to talk to you, Fee." Fee turned to me and smiled graciously. She held out her hand and I shook it. She had long fingers to match her long body and beautifully manicured fingernails painted scarlet to match everything else. "I don't think we've had the pleasure," she said in a clipped, crystal-clear accent. "No," I said, "we haven't." I noticed that close up, and underneath her heavily made-up face, she was a lot older than I'd realised. But then, if she were a former classmate of Bert's, she must, like him, be in her late 70s. "I've just moved into the area," I continued, "and was chatting with Stanley Fogg earlier in the Riverside Cafe. Do you know him? He suggested I have a chat with you about something." At this point I began to falter, because in all truth I hadn't made a plan about what I was going to ask Fuchsia Grange, and I'd been distracted by the cat incident. She didn't seem to notice my hesitation, and instead took me by the arm and guided me over to one of the seating areas near the bar. We sat down, and she turned back to Ford and shouted, "Couple of coffees, Ford, if you don't mind, dear." Then turning to me, she said, "Is that okay, or would you prefer something a little stronger?" "Oh no, thank you," I exclaimed. "Coffee is fine. It's way too early for me." "It's never too early for me," Fee smiled wryly. "Now, my dear," she continued, tapping the top of the table with her long fingernails, "any friend of Stan's is a friend of mine. I've known the Fogg boys for years." "Yes, I believe so," I said. "Stanley's brother Bert is our next-door neighbour." "Ah," she said, "you live down Orchard Road in B. Scullion's old house." "Yes," I answered. "We only moved in a week ago, although I have to say it feels like much longer." "And who is the we, my dear?" she asked. "Oh, my daughter and I. Her name is Rachel." "How lovely," said Fee. "I would love to have had a daughter myself, but I was blessed instead by 7 sons." "7?" I said in surprise. "Yes, my dear. We tried and tried and tried, and it never happened. That is Ford and I. He's my husband. I'm not sure whether you knew that." I didn't, I said. They've all flown the nest now, though, she mused. At that, Ford approached with a tray, which he set out on the table in front of us. I picked up a hot cup of coffee and took a sip. There was a little thin biscuit in a cellophane packet on the saucer. I was starting to get a bit peckish and decided that it was probably safe to eat the biscuit since it was already wrapped and wouldn't be contaminated by anything furry from the kitchen. Fee offered me some cream from the little jug on the tray, but I declined, after noticing a small feline hair floating on the top. She began pouring some of the cream in her own coffee. "So, my dear," she said, "you say there was something you wanted to ask me." "Yes," I answered. "As I said, I was chatting with Stanley, and he mentioned that you and Bert were school friends many years ago, and that you lived in the old vicarage on Monk's Ferry Lane at one time." "Yes," she nodded, "that is true. My father was the local vicar, the Reverend Verdon Mainstay de Alderville. And yes, we all have ridiculous names," she laughed, flinging one corner of her pashmina scarf back over her shoulder. "My twin sisters are Myrna Vale and Auroria. It's a family curse." I smiled. "My mother was plain Betty Fogg," she laughed. "So you see, I'm also related to the Fogg boys too." "Ah," I exclaimed, "another Fogg." "I'm sorry, dear. What did you say?" said Fee, cupping her hand next to her ear. I realised too late that I'd said aloud what I should have said to myself. Oh, it's just that my daughter and I have noticed that there are a lot of members of the Fogg family around the town. Fogg's Cafe up the road and the butcher's," I stammered awkwardly. "Oh, yes," she laughed, interrupting me and taking a large gulp of coffee. "And I'm related to the whole damn lot of them." I smiled, relieved that she hadn't taken offence, and took a smaller sip of my own coffee. "I was wondering about the de Alderville family connection, though," I said, placing my cup back down on the saucer. "I believe that the de Aldervilles used to own the old hall, the old derelict manor house next to the church." "Oh, yes, dear. Old great-uncle Radford sold the family pile 150 years ago or something like that. But you'd have to ask my sister Myrn. She's the family historian. I'll give her a ring." She reached into an unseen pocket in her dress and brought out a tiny mobile phone with a flip cover and began tapping at some of the buttons on the keypad with the long nail on her right index finger. "What was your name again, dear?" she asked, looking up at me. "I don't think I said," I began, before Fee suddenly burst into conversation with the person on the other end of the line. "Oh, Myrn, darling, yes, I know. Next time we're going to have it put down. I keep saying to Ford, the damn thing'll have us shut down. Listen, darling, I have a lady here interested in the de Aldervilles, the history of the family and all that. Do you have time to have a chat with her? You do? Oh, wonderful. Yes, I'll tell her. Thanks, Myrn. Love to Foxy, and see you at the weekend. Oh, you will? Marvellous. Kisses." She snapped the phone shut and placed it on the table in front of her. Suddenly Ford shouted over from the bar, "Fee, can you start taking orders, my love?" I looked around and realised that the place had started getting busy. Obviously the lunchtime rush. The old house was evidently a popular eatery, despite its dubious hygiene arrangements. "Oh, I have to go, dear," said Fee, rising from her chair and putting our empty coffee cups on the tray. "But Myrn says she's happy to chat tomorrow sometime. She lives at Priory Cottage, down the road. She'll be at the fireworks display this evening. Are you going? I could introduce you. All of the town will be out." "Yes, I've just bought tickets, actually," I said, rising from my own chair. "Then I'll see you there, dear," said Fee. and walked over to a doorway near the bar, giving me a small wave before she disappeared inside. It suddenly seemed very bright as I exited the dark, stuffy interior of the old house at home, and I had to blink my eyes a couple of times. What a curious character Fee Grange d'Aldeville was. I wondered if her sister Mern was as eccentric. Well, it looked as though I was going to find out. I decided to head back home, grab some lunch, and do a bit more unpacking. I realised I hadn't managed to ask Fee about the ghost sighting, but there hadn't been an opportunity to ask really, and now that I was out in the sunshine once again, it all seemed a bit silly. Back home, a few hours later, and I'd managed to unpack 4 of the large cardboard boxes in one of the back bedrooms. I was covered in grime and had the remnants of bits of sellotape stuck to my jeans. I stood up from my kneeling position on the floor, made a big stretch with my arms and arched my back with a moan. I walked over to the large bedroom window, rested my hands on the windowsill and looked out. It was still fairly bright out there, although the sun was just getting lower in the sky and the leafless trees were making long shadows on the back of the house as they swayed softly in the breeze. I looked down at our small kitchen garden and realised that from this angle I could see sections of Rachel's recently discovered red garden gate poking out of the foliage. We'd not been able to open it first time around, and I had a sudden urge to go out and try to give it another go by myself. Once outside, I was reminded of how bitterly cold it actually was, and was glad that I put on some gloves with my winter coat. I held out the brass key that Rachel had left on the kitchen table and watched it glint tantalisingly in the late afternoon light. "Okay, let's give this another go," I said to the key, and wandered over to the area near the garden gate. I pulled at some more of the weeds and ivy that stubbornly clung to it and scraped around the ridge in the stone that framed the door with a piece of rusty metal that I'd found lying on the floor. Then I put the key in the lock and turned it slowly. Again there was a click like last time, but this time there seemed to be more movement. I yanked at the door's edges, and slowly it began to give way and open with a protesting creak. Then, kicking away more of the overgrown weeds at its base, I tugged at the door until I'd managed to wedge it open about 8 inches. Looking down, I noticed that now, where I'd kicked away the weeds, there was a pretty tiled pathway which seemed to extend through the doorway and out to the space beyond. Rachel was going to be so excited about this, I thought, but what to do now? The sun was starting to set. Should I open the door a bit more so that I could go through to the other side and take a look around, or would Rachel be cross that I hadn't waited for her first? I decided to carry on and gave the wooden gate a kick at the bottom and one final heave. As it gave way, I lost my balance and ended up on my backside. Fortunately, my fall was broken by a pile of discarded shrubbery, so I stood up quickly, brushed myself down, and looked up at next door's upper floor, hoping Bert hadn't been looking out of a bedroom window at the same time. I peered through the opening in the stone wall, made by the now fully open garden gate, and was greeted by another mass of overgrown weeds and foliage. I pushed myself forward and tried to make a passageway through the vegetation by pressing it firmly to one side with my arms and trampling it down with my shoes. I made about 6 feet of headway when all of a sudden there was a gap in the undergrowth and I stepped out into a secluded, ornately tiled courtyard surrounded on all 4 sides by various moss-covered stone plinths. I stood still with my mouth slightly agape. This was amazing. On the top of 2 of the plinths were 2 large urns, and on another sat a huge shiny marble orb covered in ivy. Another plinth held a large stone peacock, and there was also a stone dog sitting on its haunches on a shorter plinth. In the centre of the decorative tiling was a metallic sundial which glinted in the fading light of the day. I walked over to it and stroked it with my gloved hand. Much of the metal was tarnished, but small parts of it still shone brightly. I turned slowly in a circle to get a full look at the courtyard. It was bordered on all four sides by the same high stone wall as the one surrounding our garden. Set into the wall furthest away from me was another garden gate. This one was arched and looked almost medieval in design, with its square panels of beaten welded metal. The light was really starting to dwindle now, and it was quiet in the courtyard, save for the sound of a couple of little birds that chased each other between the trees and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I walked to the far end of the courtyard to take a better look at the metal gate. I really couldn't see much at all now, so I bent down and pressed my gloved fingers over the surface of the metal until I found a keyhole. "Seems like we need another key," I murmured to myself. "Seems like we do," said a voice suddenly from behind me, and I yelped, nearly jumping out of my skin with fright. "Good God, Rachel, are you trying to do away with me?" I exclaimed. She grinned, turned on the torch she was carrying and held up her arms in the air. "Mum," she cried, "look what you've found." Part 10. Fireworks. "So does the secret garden belong to us?" asked Rachel, munching on a warm hot dog smothered in tomato ketchup. "I doubt it, Rach," I answered, licking my lips and wiping my fingers on the paper napkin that came with my own hot dog. "It wasn't included in the sale of the house, that much I know." "But it's secret. It doesn't look as though anybody owns it. We could adopt it," she said, grinning at me. I grinned back. "Well, we have the key," I said. We were standing in a large, crowded field. In the distance was the ghostly outline of the old priory, lit up in parts by the flames of a huge, crackling bonfire. Suddenly, there was a loud bang and sizzle, and showers of silver and blue sparkles exploded into the night sky, creating vivid arched patterns in the darkness before falling like glittery rain back down to the earth. There were cries of "ooh" and "ah" from the assembled townspeople, who all appeared to have turned out for the town's fireworks display. With a mouthful of hot dog, I motioned to Rachel to take a look at a small group of people standing with their backs to us in the near distance. One of the ladies was tall and thin with bright scarlet hair. I mumbled something unintelligible to Rachel and at the same time managed to spill fried onions down the front of my coat. "Mum," said Rachel, handing me her paper napkin, "honestly." "Thanks," I said, taking the napkin from her. "Did you hear what I said?" "Nope, not a word," said Rachel, helping me wipe off the tomatoey onion. "It's Fee Grange, standing over there. The tall lady with the bright hair. You know, I told you I spoke to her this afternoon." "Oh, yeah," said Rachel, nodding and turning to look at the tall lady. "I wonder if that's her sister Mern standing next to her," I said. "Well, there's only one way to find out," said Rachel. "Let's go and speak to them." Just as we were about to head in the direction of Fee Grange and her companions, a large lady in a huge coat bustled her way up to us. "I thought it was you," said the large woman in a loud voice. It was Gran from Chaplin's bookshop. I smiled and began to introduce her to Rachel. "Oh, you look very familiar, young lady," said Gran, eyeing her up and down. "Have we met before?" "Nope," said Rachel, shaking her head and looking away self-consciously. Ooh, I could have sworn. Anyway, this is Mrs. Fogg from the cafe in the High Street, she continued, pointing to a small, timid-looking woman standing next to her, who was gripping hold of a little handbag tightly with both hands. I was telling her you were looking for books today. Rachel looked at me wide-eyed, and I gave her a "don't go there" look with my eyes. She grinned back at me and looked down at her feet, trying to suppress a giggle. She knows a lot about the history of the town, don't you, Beryl? Said Gran, nudging the woman's shoulder. Beryl nodded at Gran, and then squished her face at me. Onion rings, she said suddenly, pointing to the sleeve of my coat. Oops, I said, brushing the limp vegetables onto the floor. I had an accident with a hot dog before. Beryl doesn't like hot dogs, do you, Beryl? Or fireworks, said Gran, leaning over and shouting the question loudly into Beryl's ear. Not really, said Beryl nervously. If it was up to me, I'd be tucked up in bed with a cup of Ovaltine and a Catherine Cookson novel by now. Tell 'em what you know about Monk's Ferry, said Gran, ignoring her friend's answer and continuing to bellow in her ear. What do they want to know? Said Beryl, looking puzzled. What do you want to know? Shouted Gran in our direction. Rachel and I looked at each other perplexed. Oh, you've caught us off guard, I answered. Perhaps we could chat with you at another time, Beryl, somewhere where it's not so noisy. Right on cue. A rocket flew skyward, shrieking into the air and exploding with a bang and a shower of silver and gold glitter. Beryl jumped and clutched even more tightly to her handbag. Rachel looked over at me with a jaded expression, and I knew that was my cue to bring the conversation to an end. Well, we must be going, I said hurriedly to Gran and Beryl. It was very nice to meet you both. I'll be popping into the bookshop tomorrow morning to pick up my book. Will you be there? Not if I can help it, said Gran. Awful musty place. My husband Arthur should be there, back on his feet. You can chat with him. And with that, Gran reached for Beryl's elbow and yanked her away in the direction of the hot dog stand. Rachel looked at me in bewilderment. What book? She said. Oh, I wanted it to be a surprise, I said. Now I've ruined it. Ruined what? Well, I might as well tell you. When I popped into Chaplin's Books this morning to pick up the tickets, there was a copy of the Reverend Griffin's book on the history of Monk's Ferry there, like the one in the library, and I just had to have it. No way. Really? Said Rachel. Yes, and it was probably owned by... My sentence was suddenly interrupted by a high-pitched female voice crying, Yoo-hoo! It was Fee Grange, who came striding towards us with another tall lady in tow. Darling, she cried as she got closer. You made it. And who is this enchanting young woman with you? Rachel, pleased to meet you, said Rachel, offering Fee Grange her hand. Oh, how charming. The daughter, cried Fee to her female companion, grabbing hold of Rachel's hand and shaking it enthusiastically. This is my sister Mern. Mern, this is the lady I was telling you about on the phone. Mern smiled at both Rachel and I in turn, but took a particularly long, lingering look at Rachel. She spotted the look instantly. I know, you think you've met me before, she said to Mern. Mern smiled again, but didn't respond. She was a little shorter than her sister, but with the same long, willowy figure. She wore plainer, more practical clothes than Fee. Smart jeans, leather boots, and a dark jacket with a little silver diamond-studded brooch in the shape of a peacock on one lapel. The soft pink scarf around her neck complemented her shock of white hair and deep blue eyes. Fee tells me that you'd like to know more about the d'Aldeville family, she said, in the same crystal-clear accent as her sisters. Yes, that's right, I said. We're also interested in the history of the old hall, too, and anything you might be able to tell us about the Pike family who lived there more recently. Well, they are, of course, all inherently linked, she said. Then looking directly at Rachel, continued, You must pop by tomorrow morning. And then at me. Both of you. I live just over there. She pointed in the direction of the ruined priory. The cottage is just off the main entrance. Come by and we can chat. I have some things to show you. I woke early the next morning and wandered down to the kitchen. Rachel was already downstairs, curled up on the comfy chair with a mug of hot tea in one hand. With the other, she was rubbing her stomach and making little moaning sounds. Too much Bonfire toffee last night? I asked, noticing the empty paper packet carelessly discarded on the table. I will never eat that stuff again, she said firmly. I tutted at her and shook my head in mock disapproval as I picked up the toffee packet and tossed it in the bin. She made a face and pulled her tongue out at me, which was now dyed a bright shade of treacle brown. Are you coming with me to see Mern this morning? I asked her. Yep, she said, taking a small sip of her tea. I'm not in work until this afternoon. That's good. Did you manage to get any more of your research done yesterday? I said, noticing the old packet of documents and notebook piled at the side of her chair. No, Mondays are too busy. We get the schools in. I spent pretty much all day herding groups of bored, snotty kids around the archive room. I grinned. So no more revelations about the Pikes and the Scullions, then? Well, there is this, she said, reaching for her notebook and opening a bookmarked page. Sue passed this on to me. It's a computer printout of the newspaper article from 1872 that talks about Elizabeth Pike's funeral, but I haven't had time to read it yet. I took the piece of paper from her. But we have this, I said, handing it back. We do, but don't you remember that the bottom section of the report was missing, she said. No, I don't remember, I said, but anyway, what does it say? Rachel began reading. Late edition. Our reporter notes that the deceased lady's inquest, which should have been held today at the Old House at Home public house, did not in fact take place. Indeed, an examination of the body, which had been authorised by Detective Heath, was cancelled at the last minute by Dr. Cuthbert Griffin, the brother of the Reverend Griffin, and the lady's funeral brought forward. Our reporter is led to believe that there had been some confusion at the mortuary. We are also informed that Dr. Cuthbert did not attend the funeral, as formerly reported. What? I exclaimed. There was no inquest? Should there have been? Said Rachel. Well, yes. Elizabeth Pike died a violent death in unexplained circumstances. A coroner should have held an inquest. The body should have been examined. There would have been a jury and witnesses to cross-examine. Rachel, this is bizarre. Why did Cuthbert Griffin cancel it and bring her funeral forward? Rachel sat open-mouthed. She looked down again at the article in her hand. Do you think he had something to do with her death? She asked me. Either that, or this was a cover-up, Rachel. To bury the body before it had been examined. I'm at a loss as to say why that would have been allowed. Then this is the first piece of information we've had which might help us begin to identify the murderer, she said. But this information was public knowledge. It's in the newspaper. Why didn't the police at the time investigate it further? It doesn't make sense, I added. It all points to Cuthbert, Mum. He didn't attend her funeral either. Where was he? she said. I shook my head in bewilderment. Then suddenly I had a thought. There is something else, actually, I said, picking up my phone from the kitchen table. It might be nothing, but you know I told you about finding Reverend Charles Griffin's book at the bookshop yesterday, the one I'm picking up this morning. Rachel nodded. Well, inside it is an inscription, a dedication on one of the pages at the front. I took a photograph on my phone. What does it say? Said Rachel, standing up from her chair. She came over to me and I passed her my phone. She squinted at the image on the screen and began enlarging it with her fingers. Oh, it was Cecil's book, she exclaimed. The artist's brother. Yes, given to him by Charles, I added. Is that Latin? Said Rachel, and began reading out the inscription. To my dearest brother Cecil, culpum poena premit commis veritatum dies apparit Charles, March 1901. She picked up her notebook and pen and began copying down the inscription on an empty page. Then she picked up her own phone and typed the Latin phrases into her web browser. So, the first bit's from Horace, she said. Horace? I asked. Yeah, Roman dude, Latin lyric poet and satirist under the Emperor Augustus, 1st century BC, she read. But what does it mean? I said impatiently. One of the translations is, punishment presses hard upon the heels of crime. Then the next bit, veritatum dies apparit, means... She stopped and stared at me wide-eyed. What? I said. Time discloses truth, she said slowly. We both looked at each other in wonder. The plot thickens, I said. And those are the first 10 parts of my story, Hallows House. This has been Kate at the Library of Whispers. I hope you'll join me again for the rest of the story. Bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.